March 13th, 1811. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the fortress town of Campo Maior in Portuguese Extremadura, just miles from the Spanish border. The morning mist clings to the rolling hills, and through it, like ghosts materializing from another world, come the columns. French columns. 9,000 men advancing in the disciplined formations that have conquered most of Europe, their bayonets catching the first pale light of day. The drums begin their ominous rhythm, that sound every British soldier has learned to dread, the pas de charge, the attack march that has preceded French victories from the pyramids to the gates of Vienna. But standing between those columns and their objective are 3,000 British and Portuguese soldiers. 3,000 men who, by every rational calculation, should not be here, should not be standing their ground, should certainly not be preparing to fight. At the head of each French column, gleaming even in the weak morning light, are the eagles. The imperial eagles of Napoleon Bonaparte, those golden standards personally blessed by the emperor himself, each one representing the honor and glory of an entire regiment. To lose an eagle is not merely to lose a battle, it is to lose one's soul. In all the years of Napoleon's conquests, in all the battles from Austerlitz to Jena, from Friedland to Wagram, the French have lost only a handful of eagles. They are sacred. They are untouchable. By nightfall, the British will have captured 2 of them. This is not Waterloo. This is not even a battle whose name you likely recognize. No famous general led the British forces here. No grand strategy hung in the balance. No artist later painted a dramatic canvas of the moment. No poet composed stirring verses about the valor displayed on this field. And yet, what happened here, on this forgotten morning in the Portuguese borderlands, represents one of the most audacious victories in British military history. A victory so complete, so improbable, so devastating to French arms that it seems almost fictional in its details. 3,000 against 9,000, outnumbered 3-1. And not merely defeating them, but routing them, capturing their sacred eagles, and turning what should have been a French triumph into a catastrophe that would send shockwaves through Napoleon's armies in Spain. You need to understand something about the imperial eagles before we go further. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, he consciously reached back to the Roman Empire for his symbols of power. Each French regiment was presented with its own golden eagle standard, modeled on the aquilae of Rome's legions. These were not mere flags to be replaced if lost. Each eagle was unique, numbered, personally presented by Napoleon or his marshals in elaborate ceremonies. To defend one's eagle was the highest duty. To save an eagle from capture was grounds for immediate promotion and honor. To lose one was unthinkable. Officers would commit suicide rather than face the shame. In the entire Napoleonic Wars, fewer than a dozen French eagles would ever be captured by enemy forces. The British Army, by March of 1811, had captured exactly none. That morning at Campo Maior, they would take 2 in a single engagement. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the battle you've never heard of, the Battle of Campo Maior. This is the story of 3,000 men who stood their ground when wisdom dictated retreat, who attacked when outnumbered 3-1, who achieved what should have been impossible. This is the story of forgotten soldiers who performed unforgettable deeds, and of a victory so complete that it demands an answer to a troubling question. Why has history forgotten it? The morning mist was beginning to burn off, the drums were growing louder, and 3,000 men prepared to face 9,000, knowing that by day's end they would either be dead, captured, or have accomplished something that would echo through the corridors of military history. If only anyone had remembered to listen. The Peninsular War, by March of 1811, had become Napoleon's bleeding wound, his Spanish ulcer, as he himself bitterly called it. What had begun in 1807 as a seemingly straightforward operation to extend French control over the Iberian Peninsula had metastasized into a grinding, brutal conflict that was draining France of men, money, and prestige. The emperor, who had conquered Austria, Prussia, and a dozen other nations with lightning campaigns lasting mere weeks, found himself mired in a war that refused to end against an enemy that refused to fight by the accepted rules of European warfare. Spain and Portugal had not submitted as other nations had. They had not accepted French dominance with the resigned pragmatism of the German states or the exhausted acquiescence of Austria after Wagram. Instead, they had erupted into a savage guerrilla war, the Little War, as the Spanish called it, though there was nothing little about its effects. French supply columns were ambushed. Messengers were found with their throats cut. Isolated garrisons were massacred in the night. And when French forces moved in strength to crush the resistance in one region, it simply flared up in another, like trying to stamp out a brush fire with your bare hands. Into this chaotic theater, Britain had inserted a military expedition. It was not a large force, not by the standards of the vast armies clashing across Central Europe, but it was professional, well led, and it gave the Spanish and Portuguese resistance something they desperately needed: a conventional force capable of meeting the French in open battle. That force was commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley, who by 1811 had been elevated to Viscount Wellington for his victories at Talavera and elsewhere. Wellington was not a romantic figure in the mold of Nelson. He was cold, calculating, aristocratic to the point of hauteur, and utterly brilliant at the art of war. He understood that he could not afford to lose his army. Britain had only one army in the peninsula, and if it were destroyed, the entire British effort would collapse. So he fought cautiously, choosing his ground carefully, retreating when necessary, advancing only when the odds favored him. But Wellington's caution did not mean his subordinates were equally restrained. And in the spring of 1811, one of those subordinates, Marshal William Carr Beresford, was about to find himself in a situation where caution was not an option. The strategic situation in early 1811 was complex, as it always was in the peninsula. The French controlled most of Spain, but their hold was tenuous, constantly threatened by guerrillas and by Wellington's army, which had spent the winter behind the formidable lines of Torres Vedras, a series of fortifications protecting Lisbon that had stopped the French Marshal Massena's invasion cold. Massena had retreated, his army half-starved and demoralized, and Wellington had followed cautiously, pushing the French back into Spain. The French still held several key fortresses along the Portuguese border: Badajoz, Ciudad Rodrigo, Almeida, fortresses that served as springboards for invasions and as anchors for French control of the region. Campo Mayor was one such fortress. It sat in Portuguese Extremadura, near the Spanish border, a walled town that had changed hands several times during the war. In March of 1811, it was held by a French garrison under General Philippon, and it was a thorn in the side of any British operations in the region. Marshal Beresford, commanding a British-Portuguese force, had been tasked with driving the French out of southern Portugal and, if possible, capturing Badajoz, the great fortress that dominated the region. But first, Campo Mayor had to be dealt with. Beresford was an interesting figure, one of those competent but not brilliant officers who populate the ranks of military history. He was the illegitimate son of an Irish nobleman, a fact that had complicated his social standing but not prevented his rise in the army. Wellington trusted him enough to give him independent command, and Beresford had proven himself capable, particularly in organizing and training the Portuguese army, which under his leadership had transformed from a disorganized rabble into a force that could stand alongside British regulars. But Beresford was not a daring commander. He was methodical, careful, the sort of officer who did not take unnecessary risks, which makes what happened at Campo Mayor all the more remarkable. By mid-March, Beresford had Campo Mayor under siege. It was not a large garrison, perhaps 1,000 men, and it could not hold out indefinitely, but the French were not going to abandon it without a fight. Marshal Soult, commanding French forces in southern Spain, dispatched a relief force under General Latour Maubourg to break the siege and resupply the garrison. It was a powerful force, 9,000 men, mostly cavalry, the elite of French arms. La Tour Maubourg was confident. He had overwhelming numbers, veteran troops, and the element of surprise. The British force besieging Campo Mayor was divided, with some units watching other French garrisons, others guarding supply lines. If La Tour Maubourg could strike quickly, he could scatter the British, relieve the garrison, and perhaps inflict a stinging defeat that would force Beresford to abandon his operations in the region entirely. It was a sound plan. It should have worked. The French columns that marched toward Campo Mayor on the night of March 12th were in high spirits. They were veterans, many of them survivors of battles across Europe. They had served in the Grande Armée, had seen the great victories, had marched through conquered capitals. The British were good soldiers. They acknowledged that. Stubborn, disciplined, hard to break, but 3-to-1 odds against cavalry in open country? This was not even going to be a battle. It was going to be a manhunt. Among those French regiments were the 26th Dragoons and the 2nd Hussars, both carrying their imperial eagles. The eagles were always carried into battle, held high by specially selected officers, the porte-aigle, the eagle-bearer, flanked by guards whose sole duty was to protect the standard. To be chosen as an eagle-bearer was an honor beyond measure. To protect the eagle was a duty that superseded even one's own life. The eagles had flown at Austerlitz. They had been present at Jena, at Friedland. They represented not just regimental honor, but the glory of France itself, the genius of the emperor, the superiority of French arms over all others. By the end of March 13th, both of those eagles would be in British hands, and the men who had carried them would be dead or captured. But in the pre-dawn darkness of March 13th, no one in the French columns believed such an outcome was even remotely possible. They advanced with confidence, with the drums beating and the cavalry sabers rattling in their scabbards. They were coming to relieve Campo Mayor, to scatter the British besiegers, to add another victory to the long list of French triumphs in the peninsula. The British, meanwhile, were in a precarious position. Beresford's main force was concentrated around Campo Mayor, but he had detached several units to cover different approaches and to watch other French garrisons. One of those detached forces was commanded by Major General Robert Long, a cavalry officer with a reputation for aggression that sometimes bordered on recklessness. Long commanded a brigade of British and Portuguese cavalry, the 13th Light Dragoons, some Portuguese cavalry, and supporting units, along with a small force of infantry and artillery. In total, perhaps 3,000 men, scattered across several miles of countryside. When word reached Long that a large French force was approaching, he faced a decision. The prudent course would be to retreat, to fall back on Beresford's main force, to avoid being caught by a superior enemy in open country where cavalry could maneuver freely. Long was outnumbered 3-to-1. His force was dispersed. He had no fortified position to defend. Every principle of military science dictated withdrawal. Long decided to fight. It was, by any objective measure, a questionable decision. Long's subordinates certainly thought so. But Long believed, and here we enter the realm of military judgment where rational calculation gives way to instinct and aggression, that the French could be caught at a disadvantage. They were advancing rapidly, confident, perhaps too confident. If the British could strike quickly, unexpectedly, with determination, they might achieve something. What that something was, Long probably could not have articulated clearly. But he was a cavalry officer, and cavalry officers are trained to attack, to seize the initiative, to turn defense into offense. And so, as the sun rose on March 13th, 1811, 3,000 British and Portuguese soldiers prepared to meet 9,000 French veterans in open battle. The disparity in numbers was obvious to everyone. The likely outcome seemed equally obvious. The French were already savoring their victory. The British soldiers, checking their equipment, tightening saddle girths, fixing bayonets, knew they were in for the fight of their lives. None of them knew they were about to participate in one of the most lopsided victories in British military history. None of them knew that by sunset they would have accomplished something that Wellington's entire army had not yet achieved: the capture of French imperial eagles. None of them knew that their names, their regiments, their deeds would be almost entirely forgotten by history, overshadowed by larger battles, more famous generals, more celebrated victories. But on that cold March morning, with the mist still clinging to the hills and the French drums growing louder with each passing moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were British soldiers and they were going to stand their ground. What mattered was that they were facing impossible odds, and they were going to fight anyway. What mattered was that the French thought this was going to be easy, and the British were about to teach them a very painful lesson about assumptions. The terrain around Campo Maior was typical of the Portuguese Extremadura: rolling hills, scattered oak trees, patches of scrub, and open fields broken by low stone walls and the occasional stream. It was cavalry country, which favored the French with their superior numbers of mounted troops. There were no great natural obstacles behind which the British could shelter, no narrow defiles where numbers would not matter, no fortified positions to occupy. It was, from a British perspective, about the worst possible ground on which to fight a defensive battle against superior cavalry, which is perhaps why Long decided not to fight defensively at all. The British had learned hard lessons fighting the French over the years. They had learned at Buenos Aires and at Vimero, at Talavera and at Busaco. They had learned that French columns, for all their intimidating appearance, could be stopped by well-disciplined volleys from troops in line formation. They had learned that French cavalry, for all their dash and elan, could be broken by steady British squares. But they had also learned something else. Something that French commanders were often reluctant to acknowledge: that British troops, when properly led, and when their blood was up, could match French aggression with aggression of their own. The British were not simply defensive fighters. They could attack with the best of them. And British cavalry, though often criticized for lack of discipline and control, could charge with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. Long's plan, if it can be called a plan, rather than an aggressive improvisation, was to use his cavalry to strike at the French before they could deploy properly. The French were advancing in columns, confident in their numbers, not expecting serious resistance. If the British could hit them hard and fast, create confusion, disrupt their formations, they might achieve local superiority at the point of contact, even if they were outnumbered overall. It was risky. It was audacious. It was probably reckless. It was also exactly the sort of action that wins battles that should not be won. The 13th Light Dragoons were about to earn their place in history, though history would prove remarkably ungrateful for their efforts. They were a relatively young regiment, having been raised only in 1715, and they lacked the ancient lineage of some cavalry units. But what they lacked in historical pedigree, they more than compensated for in fighting spirit. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in India and the West Indies before being shipped to the peninsula. They knew their business. They knew how to handle a horse in combat, how to use terrain, how to maintain formation in the chaos of a cavalry melee. And on this particular morning, they were commanded by officers who believed in closing with the enemy and deciding matters with cold steel. Lieutenant Colonel Head, commanding the 13th, was cut from the same cloth as Long, aggressive, confident, perhaps overly eager to come to grips with the French. In another context, these qualities might have been liabilities. On March 13th, they were exactly what the situation demanded. Because what the British needed was not caution or careful calculation, but audacity bordering on madness. They needed officers who would look at 9,000 French soldiers and see not an overwhelming force to be avoided, but an opportunity to be seized. The French advance guard came into view shortly after dawn. They were moving with the confidence of men who expected no serious opposition. Cavalry units spread out, scouting ahead of the main columns, looking for the British force that intelligence suggested was somewhere in the area. When they spotted the British cavalry drawn up in the distance, there must have been a moment of puzzlement. Why were the British not retreating? Did they not realize how badly outnumbered they were? Were they ignorant of the size of the French force approaching? The French cavalry paused, reformed, sent riders back to bring up the main body. There was no rush. The British were not going anywhere. They were trapped, outnumbered, in open country. The French could take their time, deploy properly, and crush them at leisure. Except the British were not waiting to be crushed. Long gave the order to advance. The trumpets sounded. That particular series of notes that every cavalry horse knew meant one thing: charge. And 3 squadrons of the 13th Light Dragoons surged forward, not at a trot or a canter, but at a full gallop, straight at the French cavalry that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. It was not a parade ground charge. There was no perfect dressing of the ranks, no textbook maintenance of formation. This was a hell-for-leather assault by men who knew that their only chance of survival was to hit the enemy so hard and so fast that numbers would not matter. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves. The morning air filled with the jingling of harness, the creak of leather, the shouted commands of sergeants trying to maintain some semblance of order as several hundred horses accelerated to full speed. The French saw them coming and must have thought the British had gone mad. No sane cavalry officer would charge in this manner against superior numbers. It violated every principle of cavalry tactics. It was suicide. And then the British hit them. A cavalry charge is not a thing that can be adequately described to someone who has never witnessed one. The paintings and the histories speak of glory and drama, of heroic deeds and martial valor. They rarely capture the sheer visceral terror of being on the receiving end of several hundred horses driven at full speed into your position. They rarely convey the noise, the screaming of men and horses, the crash of bodies colliding, the ringing of sabers on sabers, and sabers on helmets and sabers on flesh. They rarely describe the smell, the sweat of horses and men, the copper tang of blood, the acrid smell of fear. The 13th Light. Dragoons crashed into the French advance guard like a hammer blow. Men were knocked from their saddles by the sheer momentum of the impact. Horses went down, screaming and thrashing. Sabers rose and fell, finding targets, drawing blood, killing and maiming. The French, for all their experience, for all their confidence, were momentarily stunned. They had expected a skirmish, perhaps, a brief exchange before the British retreated. They had not expected this, a full-blooded cavalry charge delivered with the absolute commitment and shocking violence. The French line buckled, not broke, not yet, but buckled. Men were falling, horses were panicking, units were losing cohesion. The British were pressing forward, pushing into the French formation, creating chaos where there had been order. It was brutal, close quarters fighting, the kind where you could see the face of the man you were trying to kill, where you could hear his curses and his cries as your saber found its mark. And in that moment of chaos, something remarkable happened. The French, outnumbering the British more than 2 to 1, began to give ground. It was not a rout, not yet. It was a fighting withdrawal, units pulling back to reform, trying to create space to reorganize. But they were moving backward, and the British were moving forward, and in cavalry combat, momentum is everything. The side that is advancing has the psychological advantage. The side that is retreating, even if doing so in good order, has already lost a portion of the battle. Long, watching from a slight rise, saw the French beginning to withdraw and made another decision that any reasonable officer would have questioned. Instead of consolidating his position, instead of reforming his cavalry and preparing for the inevitable French counterattack, he ordered his entire force forward. Not just the 13th Light Dragoons, but his Portuguese cavalry as well, and his small force of infantry brought up at the double. He was going to attack the entire French force with his 3,000 men. His subordinates must have thought he had lost his mind. The French were beginning to reform. Their main body was coming up. Artillery was being brought forward. The smart move was to withdraw, to break contact, to fall back on Beresford's main force before the French could bring their superior numbers to bear. Instead, Long was ordering a general advance against an enemy that outnumbered him 3-1. But there was a method to the madness, even if it was not immediately apparent to everyone. Long understood something about cavalry combat, something about human psychology in battle. The French were off balance. They had expected an easy victory and had instead been bloodied in the initial encounter. They were reforming, yes, but they were also reassessing, questioning their assumptions, wondering what had just happened. If the British pressed now, immediately, giving the French no time to settle, no time to organize a proper counterattack, there was a chance, a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless, that the French confidence could be shattered entirely. It was a gamble. Everything about this engagement was a gamble. But Long had already committed to the throw of the dice, and he was not going to stop now. The Portuguese cavalry on the British left swept forward, engaging French units that were still trying to deploy from march column into battle formation. The infantry, huffing and panting from their rapid advance, formed line and began volleying into French cavalry that ventured too close. And the 13th Light Dragoons, having already bloodied the French once, reformed with remarkable speed and prepared to charge again. The French, to their credit, were not panicking. These were veteran troops, and they knew how to fight. Officers were shouting orders, units were forming up, artillery pieces were being unlimbered. Given a few minutes, they would have their overwhelming numerical superiority organized and deployed, and then the British would be in serious trouble. Everything depended on not giving them those few minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Head, at the front of the 13th Light Dragoons, spotted something that made his pulse quicken. Through the dust and the confusion, he could see French columns reforming, and there, in the center of one column, was the flash of gold, an imperial eagle. The standard of the 26th Dragoons being held high by its bearer, surrounded by a protective guard of officers and troopers. It was perhaps 300 yards away, on the far side of a mass of French cavalry that was still trying to organize itself. Head made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational observer. He was going to take that eagle. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for orders from Long. He simply turned to his trumpeter and gave the command to charge. The trumpets sounded, and the 13th Light Dragoons, many of them still breathing hard from their first charge, gathered themselves and surged forward again. This was not a neat, organized charge. Units were mixed together, formations had dissolved in the first engagement, and men were following their officers more by instinct than by any formal structure. But they were moving forward, and they were heading straight for the French column that held the eagle. The French saw them coming this time and tried to brace for impact. Infantry formed hasty squares, cavalry units wheeled to meet the threat, officers screamed commands. But the British were already upon them, crashing through the outer screen of French cavalry, pushing deeper into the French formation, heading for the column's center where the eagle gleamed like a beacon. Sergeant Patrick Howley of the 13th Light Dragoons would later describe the next few minutes as the most chaotic of his entire military career. And this was a man who had fought in a dozen major engagements. There was no front line, no rear, just a swirling melee of horses and men, everyone fighting everyone, sabers flashing, pistols firing at point-blank range, men grappling and falling and dying. The dust was so thick you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. The noise was deafening, and through it all, the British pressed forward, driving toward that golden eagle. The Porte-Aigle of the 26th Dragoons, a young officer named Guillemont, saw the British cavalry breaking through and knew instantly what they were after. He gripped the eagle staff tighter and shouted for the guard to rally around him. A dozen French dragoons formed a tight circle around the standard, sabers drawn, prepared to die rather than let the eagle fall into enemy hands. They were brave men. They did their duty, and it was not enough. A British dragoon named John Ferrier crashed his horse through the outer ring of defenders and swung his saber at Guillemot. The blow was partially deflected, but still struck the French officer in the shoulder, causing him to stagger. The eagle's staff wavered. Another British dragoon, Corporal Logan, drove his horse alongside and reached for the standard. Guillemot, bleeding and desperate, tried to pull it away, but Logan had already grabbed the shaft. They struggled for a moment, both men gripping the eagle's staff, neither willing to let go, their horses pressed close together in the crush of bodies. Then a French dragoon behind Guillemot slashed at Logan with his saber, opening a deep cut across the corporal's face. Logan, half blinded by blood, lost his grip on the eagle. Guillemot pulled it back, tried to pass it to another officer, but Ferrier was still there, and he brought his saber down again, this time with enough force to knock Guillemot from his saddle. The French officer fell, still clutching the eagle, and disappeared beneath the trampling hooves. Private Thomas Gough, following close behind Ferrier and Logan, saw the eagle fall and spurred his horse forward. He leapt from his saddle, a desperate move in the middle of a cavalry melee, and landed next to the fallen Guillemot. The French officer was dying, blood pouring from multiple wounds, but he still had one hand on the eagle staff. Gough pried his fingers loose, grabbed the standard, and held it aloft. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. British and French alike saw the golden eagle, the sacred standard of the 26th Dragoons, being held by a British private. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The French defenders, who had been fighting with desperate courage, seemed to lose heart. The British, seeing the captured eagle, found a surge of renewed energy. A cheer went up from the British ranks, a wild, triumphant roar that could be heard even over the din of battle. Gough, still on foot in the middle of a cavalry action, was immediately surrounded by British dragoons who formed a protective cordon around him. He managed to remount his horse, still clutching the eagle, and began fighting his way back toward British lines. French cavalry tried to intercept him, desperate to recapture their standard, but the British dragoons around him fought like demons, cutting down anyone who came close. And while this drama was playing out in one part of the field, a similar scene was unfolding elsewhere. The 2nd Hussar, another French regiment, had deployed their eagle in the center of their formation, believing it would inspire their men and that it was safe behind multiple lines of cavalry. They had not counted on the sheer reckless aggression of the British cavalry, nor on the chaos that had engulfed the entire French force. A troop of the 13th Light Dragoons, led by Captain Brotherton, had become separated from the main body during the initial charge and found themselves on the French right flank, behind what should have been secure French lines. In any conventional battle, this would have been a death sentence, a small group of cavalry isolated deep in enemy territory, surrounded by thousands of hostile troops. Brotherton knew he should withdraw, fight his way back to friendly lines before the French realized his vulnerability and moved to cut him off. Instead, he saw the eagle of the 2nd Hussars. It was being carried in the midst of a French column that was attempting to reform after being disrupted by the British attack. The column was in some disarray, not routed but not properly organized either, with men and horses intermixed, officers trying to restore order, units that had been separated trying to rejoin their formations. The eagle was visible in the center of this confusion, held high by its bearer, a beacon meant to rally the scattered French troops. Brotherton made a calculation that would have seemed mad to anyone not caught up in the fever of combat. He had perhaps 40 men with him. The French column numbered well over 1,000. But the column was disordered, and the eagle was there, tantalizingly close, and Brotherton was a cavalry officer who had spent his entire career being told that cavalry existed to seize opportunities that infantry could not. This was an opportunity. It might be suicide, but it was an opportunity. He gave the order to charge. 40 British dragoons spurred their horses forward, heading straight for the center of a French column that outnumbered them more than 20 to 1. The French saw them coming and tried to react, but there was not enough time. Units were still reforming, men were scattered, and before proper defensive measures could be taken, the British were in among them, slashing with their sabres, driving toward the Eagle with single-minded determination. The Porte-Aigle of the 2nd Hussar was a veteran officer named Domenjou, a man who had carried his regiment's Eagle through a dozen battles and who regarded its safety as more important than his own life. When he saw British cavalry breaking through toward him, he immediately spurred his horse away from the center of the column, trying to get the Eagle to safety. His guard followed, forming around him, but the British were faster. They cut through the outer screen of defenders with a violence that was shocking even by the standards of cavalry combat. Lieutenant Pearson of the 13th Light Dragoons was the first to reach Domenjou. He swung his saber at the French officer, a blow that Domenjou parried with his own blade, the Eagle's staff gripped tightly in his other hand. They exchanged cuts, both men skilled swordsmen, their horses circling each other in the press of bodies. Pearson's blade found Domenjou's arm, opening a gash that caused the French officer to drop his saber. But Domenjou still held the Eagle, and he kicked his horse into a desperate gallop, trying to break free of the melee. Sergeant Charles Weymouth, a grizzled veteran who had served in the 13th since its earliest days in the peninsula, saw the French officer trying to escape and drove his horse in pursuit. Weymouth was not a young man. He was in his late 30s, ancient by cavalry standards, but he knew his business. He urged his horse alongside Domenjou's and reached out to grab the Eagle's staff. Domenjou tried to pull away, but Weymouth had already gotten a grip on the shaft. They struggled, both men still mounted, their horses pressed together, each trying to wrench the Eagle from the other's grasp. A French hussar came to Domenjou's aid, slashing at Weymouth with his saber. The blow struck the British sergeant in the back, cutting through his jacket and drawing blood. Weymouth grunted with pain but did not release his hold on the Eagle. Instead, he pulled harder, using his weight and the strength of his horse to drag the standard toward him. Domenjou, already wounded, was losing strength. His grip weakened, and with a final wrench, Weymouth tore the Eagle free. The French hussar who had struck Weymouth tried to recover the Eagle, spurring his horse forward and reaching for the standard, but Corporal Murphy, riding close behind Weymouth, intercepted him with a saber cut that knocked the French trooper from his saddle. Weymouth, bleeding from his back wound but still mounted, held the captured Eagle high and began fighting his way back toward the rest of Brotherton's troop. The French, realizing that their Eagle had been taken, reacted with fury and desperation. Officers shouted commands. Men abandoned their positions in the forming columns and surged toward the British cavalry, determined to recapture their sacred standard. For a few minutes, Brotherton's small force was completely surrounded, fighting for their lives against overwhelming numbers. Men went down on both sides, horses screamed and fell, sabers rose and fell in a frenzy of violence. But the British had momentum and the psychological advantage of having seized the Eagle. The French, for all their numbers, were fighting in confusion, units intermixed, no clear command structure coordinating their efforts. And the British were fighting with the desperate energy of men who knew that if they failed to break out, they would all die in this press of hostile cavalry. Brotherton managed to rally his men into a rough wedge formation and drove toward what appeared to be a gap in the French encirclement. It was not a neat tactical maneuver. It was a brutal, bloody brawl on horseback, with men hacking at each other in close quarters, horses colliding, the wounded falling and being trampled. But the British kept moving, kept pushing forward, and the French lines, already disordered, could not hold them. And then suddenly they were through. Brotherton's troop burst out of the French encirclement and galloped toward British lines. Weymouth still clutching the captured Eagle, blood soaking his jacket from the wound in his back. Behind them, the French gave chase, but the British horses were fresh enough to maintain their lead, and as they approached their own lines, other British cavalry units moved forward to cover their withdrawal. In the space of perhaps 20 minutes, the British had captured 2 French Imperial Eagles, 2 standards that had flown over battlefields across Europe, that had been personally blessed by Napoleon, that represented the honor and prestige of their regiments. 2 eagles that French soldiers were supposed to defend with their lives. Both were now in British hands, carried by bleeding, exhausted dragoons who had achieved something that Wellington's entire army had not yet accomplished in 2 years of campaigning in the peninsula. The impact on French morale was catastrophic. The loss of an eagle was not simply a military reverse. It was a psychological blow that struck at the very heart of regimental pride and national honor. French officers who witnessed the eagles being taken knew immediately that this was a disaster that would reverberate far beyond this particular battlefield. Men who had fought bravely, who had done everything expected of them, were now part of regiments that had lost their eagles. The shame would follow them for the rest of their military careers. The 26th Dragoons and the 2nd Hussars, once proud units with distinguished records, would forever be marked by what happened at Campo Mayor. And the battle was not even over yet. General Latour-Maubourg, commanding the French force, had been watching the engagement with growing disbelief and fury. What should have been a straightforward operation, relieving Campo Mayor and scattering the inferior British force, had turned into a nightmare. His cavalry, which outnumbered the British more than 2 to 1, had been thrown into chaos by the British charges. His formations were disrupted, units were intermixed, and worst of all, 2 of his eagles had been captured. The loss of the eagles meant that no matter what happened now, this engagement would be remembered as a French defeat. But Latour-Maubourg was a capable officer, and he was not about to accept defeat without trying to salvage something from this disaster. He still had numerical superiority. His artillery was finally deployed and beginning to fire. His infantry, which had not yet been heavily engaged, was fresh and could be brought forward. If he could reorganize his cavalry, bring his infantry into action, and use his artillery to punish the British, he might yet turn this around. At the very least, he might be able to recapture the eagles and limit the humiliation. He ordered a general advance. The French columns, battered but not broken, began to reform and push forward. Artillery rounds began to fall among the British cavalry, forcing them to pull back from the most exposed positions. French infantry came forward in their characteristic columns, drums beating, bayonets fixed, determined to restore French honor through sheer weight of numbers. The British, for their part, were exhausted. The cavalry had made multiple charges, had fought brutal close-quarters actions, and had taken casualties. The horses were blown, many of them near collapse from the exertion. The infantry had been force-marched to the battlefield and then thrown immediately into action. Ammunition was running low, and they were still outnumbered 3 to 1. Any rational assessment of the situation would suggest that the British should withdraw now. They had achieved an extraordinary victory. 2 eagles captured, the French thoroughly bloodied. To stay and continue fighting was to risk losing everything they had gained. If the French could reorganize and bring their superior numbers to bear in a coordinated assault, the British force might be overwhelmed, and the captured eagles might be retaken. Long, however, was not in a rational frame of mind. He was intoxicated with success, convinced that the French were on the verge of total collapse, eager to press his advantage. When his subordinates suggested that it might be wise to withdraw and consolidate their gains, Long dismissed their concerns. The French were beaten, he insisted. One more push and they would break entirely. It was the kind of overconfidence that can turn victory into defeat. The British cavalry was in no condition to make another major charge. The infantry was dangerously exposed, the artillery support was minimal, and the French, for all their disorder, still had thousands of fresh troops they could commit to the fight. What saved the British from Long's overconfidence was the arrival of Beresford himself. The Marshal, hearing the sounds of heavy fighting, had ridden forward with additional forces to see what was happening. When he arrived on the field and assessed the situation, he immediately recognized how precarious the British position was. Yes, they had won an extraordinary victory. Yes, the French were in disarray. But the British force was exhausted, outnumbered, and in danger of being overwhelmed if the French mounted a coordinated counterattack. Beresford overruled Long and ordered a general withdrawal. The British would fall back to more defensible positions, take their captured eagles with them, and avoid risking everything on one more throw of the dice. Long protested, but Beresford was the senior officer, and his word was final. The withdrawal was conducted in good order, with the cavalry covering the infantry's retreat and the Portuguese troops providing flank security. The French, their own formation still in disorder, their morale shattered by the loss of the eagles, did not mount a serious pursuit. La Tour Maubourg made some half-hearted attempts to follow, but his cavalry was reluctant to engage the British again after what had happened, and his infantry could not keep pace with the British withdrawal. By mid-afternoon, the fighting had ended. The British had pulled back to rejoin Beresford's main force, carrying their captured eagles with them. The French, bloodied and humiliated, made their way to Campo Mayor, relieved the garrison, and then withdrew back into Spain. Neither side had the strength or the will to continue the engagement. The battlefield, as it always does after the fighting ends, took on a different character. The noise and chaos of combat gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the occasional shot as soldiers dispatched horses too badly injured to save. The ground was churned into mud, stained dark with blood, littered with the detritus of battle. Dropped weapons, torn equipment, the bodies of men and horses lying where they had fallen. French burial parties moved across the field under flags of truce, searching for their dead and wounded. It was grim work, made grimmer by the knowledge of what had been lost. The bodies of Guillemot and Domenjou, the two eagle-bearers, were found among the fallen. Both had died, trying to protect their standards. Both had failed in the one duty that mattered above all others. They would be buried with military honors, but their names would forever be associated with the loss of their eagles, a stain that no posthumous tribute could wash away. The French casualties were heavy, perhaps 500 killed and wounded, with another 200 captured. These were serious losses, but they were not catastrophic in purely numerical terms. French armies in the peninsula routinely absorbed such casualties and continued operating. But numbers alone did not tell the full story of what had happened at Campo Mayor. The psychological damage went far deeper than the casualty figures suggested. The loss of the two eagles dominated every conversation in the French camp that night. Officers struggled to explain how it had happened. How had a force of 3,000 British troops defeated 9,000 French? How had the eagles, protected by guards whose sole purpose was to defend them, been captured by enemy cavalry? How had formations of veteran French dragoons and hussars been thrown into such disorder that the British had been able to penetrate to the very heart of their columns? There were no good answers. Some officers blamed the terrain, though the open country had actually favored the French cavalry. Others blamed the surprise of the British attack, though the French had known the British were in the area and should have been prepared for combat. A few blamed La Tour Maubourg's leadership, though he had made no obvious tactical errors beyond underestimating British aggression. The truth, which was hard for French officers to acknowledge, was that they had been outfought by an enemy they had outnumbered 3-1. The British had simply been more aggressive, more determined, more willing to take risks. And in this particular engagement, aggression and determination had mattered more than numbers. The garrison of Campo Mayor, which had been on the verge of surrendering, was indeed relieved and resupplied. But the relief came at such a cost that it was hardly worth celebrating. The garrison would hold out for a few more days before eventually surrendering anyway, making the entire operation and the loss of the eagles seem even more futile. La Tour Maubourg withdrew his battered force back into Spain, and the campaign continued, but the memory of Campo Mayor hung over French operations in the region for months afterward. In the British camp, the mood could not have been more different. The captured eagles were the center of attention, examined and admired by every soldier who could get close enough to see them. These were not merely pieces of metal and cloth. They were symbols of French military might, personal gifts from Napoleon himself, standards that had flown over some of the most famous battlefields in Europe. And now they belonged to the British Army, captured in a battle that no one had expected the British to win. Private Thomas Gauff, who had seized the eagle of the 26th Dragoons, found himself suddenly famous within the army. Men who had never spoken to him before wanted to shake his hand, to hear the story of how he had pried the standard from the dying Guillemont's grip. Sergeant Charles Weymouth, who had captured the eagle of the 2nd Hussar despite being wounded in the process, was similarly celebrated. These were common soldiers, not officers, not aristocrats, just regular enlisted men who had done something extraordinary. The wounded were tended to as best as the Army's medical services could manage, which in 1811 meant primitive surgery performed without anesthesia, wounds cleaned with water and bandaged with whatever cloth was available, and the hope that infection would not set in. Many of the wounded would not survive the next few days. Corporal Logan, who had been slashed across the face during the fight for the first eagle, would lose his left eye. Weymouth's back wound would heal, but he would carry the scar for the rest of his life. Dozens of other dragoons bore similar wounds, marks of a battle that had been won at close quarters with saber and pistol. The horses, too, had suffered. Cavalry horses were valuable assets, carefully trained and expensive to replace. Many had been killed or so badly wounded they had to be destroyed. Others bore cuts and gashes from French sabers, would need weeks or months to recover. The 13th Light Dragoons, which had borne the brunt of the fighting, had lost nearly a third of its horses. It would be weeks before the regiment was fully combat effective again. But for all the losses, for all the wounds and the dead, the British soldiers that night felt the profound satisfaction of men who have achieved something extraordinary. They had been outnumbered 3-1 and had not merely survived, but had won decisively. They had captured French imperial eagles, something that Wellington's entire army had not yet done. They had proved to themselves, to the French, to anyone who heard the story, that British soldiers could match French aggression with their own, could take the fight to the enemy even when the odds seemed impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Head, commanding the 13th Light Dragoons, wrote in his report that night, "The conduct of the officers and men under my command exceeded anything I have witnessed in my military career. They charged with a determination and fury that completely overpowered the enemy, and they maintained their discipline and cohesion even in the most desperate circumstances. The capture of 2 French eagles is a testimony to their valor and to the superiority of British cavalry when properly led and given the opportunity to close with the enemy." It was not false modesty or bureaucratic understatement. Head genuinely believed that he had witnessed something special, something that deserved to be remembered. His men had done more than win a battle. They had captured symbols of French military pride, had taken standards that were supposed to be untouchable, had achieved what should have been impossible. Marshal Beresford, in his official dispatch to Wellington, was more measured in his language, as befitted his senior rank and his natural caution. But even Beresford could not hide his satisfaction with the outcome. "The action at Campo Mayor," he wrote, "though not decisive in strategic terms, has resulted in a signal victory for His Majesty's forces. The capture of 2 French imperial eagles is an achievement of the first order, one that reflects great credit on the officers and men engaged. Major General Long's decision to attack despite being heavily outnumbered was bold to the point of recklessness, but in this instance, boldness was rewarded with success." That final sentence, "boldness was rewarded with success," would prove prophetic in an ironic way, because Long's reckless aggression at Campo Mayor would, in the following months, lead him to make similar decisions in situations where boldness was not rewarded, where the French were better prepared, and where British cavalry charges ended in disaster rather than triumph. Long would eventually be relieved of command after a series of costly failures. But on March 13th, 1811, his aggressive instincts had been exactly what the situation required. The two captured eagles were sent back to Lisbon, where they were put on display for the army and the local population to see. Portuguese civilians, who had suffered 3 years of French occupation in various parts of their country, crowded to view these symbols of French power now lying captured and humiliated in a Lisbon warehouse. British soldiers lined up to see them, to touch them, to be part of the moment. For troops who had spent years in the peninsula fighting a grinding, often frustrating campaign against an enemy that seemed impossible to decisively defeat, the eagles represented tangible proof that the French could be beaten. Eventually, the eagles would be shipped to England, where they would be presented to the Prince Regent in a formal ceremony. They would be placed on display at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, where veterans could see them and remember what had been accomplished. They would become part of the British Army's institutional memory, proof that British cavalry could match the French in close combat, that numerical inferiority could be overcome by aggression and determination. But even as the eagles were being celebrated in Lisbon and prepared for their journey to England, something strange was happening. The Battle of Campo Mayor was already beginning to fade from public consciousness. The newspapers in London reported the capture of the eagles. Certainly, it was news too significant to ignore. But the reports were brief, often buried on inside pages, overshadowed by other events in the peninsula and by the larger strategic situation in Europe. There were no artists commissioned to paint dramatic canvases of the battle. No poets composed stirring verses about the valor of the 13th Light Dragoons. No monuments were erected to commemorate the action. Why? The answer lies partly in timing and partly in the nature of the Peninsular War itself. Campo Mayor occurred in March 1811, more than 4 years before Waterloo, at a time when the outcome of the war in the peninsula was still very much in doubt. It was a tactical victory, certainly, but it did not change the strategic situation. The French still controlled most of Spain. Wellington was still conducting a careful defensive campaign, avoiding major battles unless he had clear advantages. The capture of 2 eagles was impressive, but it did not win the war, and then, 4 years later, came Waterloo. The final, decisive battle against Napoleon himself. The battle that ended the Napoleonic Wars once and for all. At Waterloo, British cavalry would again capture French eagles, the eagle of the 45th Ligne and the eagle of the 105th Ligne, taken by the Royal Scots Greys and the Royal Dragoons in charges that would be immortalized in paintings and stories. Those eagles, captured in the most famous battle in British military history, would overshadow everything that had come before. Campo Mayor, fought in the dusty borderlands of Portugal against a second-tier French force, could not compete with the drama and significance of Waterloo. But there was more to the forgetting than just the overshadowing effect of Waterloo. The Peninsular War itself, despite lasting 6 years and involving hundreds of thousands of troops, has always occupied a somewhat ambiguous place in British military memory. It was not a war of national survival like the wars against revolutionary France in the 1790s. It was not a dramatic, short, decisive campaign like Waterloo. It was a long, grinding, often frustrating conflict fought in a distant theater, characterized more by sieges and skirmishes than by grand battles. The British public, by the time the war ended in 1814, was exhausted by decades of conflict and eager to move on. The Peninsular War became something to be acknowledged and then largely forgotten, except for a few famous battles, Talavera, Salamanca, Vittoria, and except for the reputation of Wellington himself. Campo Mayor fell through the cracks. It was not famous enough to be remembered like Salamanca, not forgotten enough to disappear entirely. It lingered in regimental histories, in the memoirs of officers who had been there, in the records of the War Office. But it did not become part of the national narrative. The men who had fought there, who had achieved something extraordinary, watched as their battle was slowly erased from public memory. overshadowed by larger events and more famous commanders. Private Thomas Gough, who had captured the first eagle, received a promotion to corporal and a small monetary reward. He would continue serving in the peninsula, would fight in several more battles, would survive the war, and eventually retire to his home village in England. When he died in 1847, his obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he had served in the Napoleonic Wars, but did not mention the capture of the eagle. The most significant act of his life, the moment that had made him briefly famous within the army, had been forgotten even in his own community. Sergeant Charles Weymouth, who had captured the second eagle despite being wounded in the process, fared somewhat better. He was commissioned as an ensign, a rare honor for a non-commissioned officer, and continued his military career. He would retire as a captain and live comfortably on his half-pay pension, but even Weymouth, in his later years, would find that people were more interested in hearing about Waterloo, a battle he had not fought in, than about Campo Mayor, where he had achieved something remarkable. The officers who had led the charges at Campo Mayor found their careers following divergent paths, shaped as much by politics and patronage as by their battlefield accomplishments. Lieutenant Colonel Head, who had commanded the 13th Light Dragoons with such aggressive effectiveness, received official commendations and was mentioned favorably in dispatches. But he was not promoted to general rank, was not given command of a brigade, was not elevated to the pantheon of celebrated cavalry officers. He remained a competent, professional soldier who had done his duty well on one particular day, and then returned to the routine work of military service in a long war. Captain Brotherton, whose troop had seized the second eagle in what was arguably an even more audacious action than the capture of the first, received even less recognition. His report of the action was noted, he was thanked by his superiors, and then the army moved on to other concerns. Brotherton would continue serving in the peninsula, would participate in other battles, would eventually retire with the rank of major. His grandchildren would barely know that he had once led 40 men in a charge against more than 1,000 French soldiers and had come away with one of Napoleon's eagles. Major General Long, whose aggressive decision-making had made the entire victory possible, would see his reputation follow a trajectory that perfectly illustrated the thin line between boldness and recklessness in military affairs. In the months following Campo Mayor, Long would order similar aggressive cavalry actions in situations where the circumstances were less favorable and where the French were better prepared. At Usagre in May 1811, just 2 months after Campo Mayor, Long would order another cavalry charge against superior French forces. This time, the charge would fail disastrously, with heavy British casualties and no compensating tactical gains. Long would be criticized, his judgment questioned, his aggressive instincts now seen as liabilities rather than assets. By late 1811, Long would be quietly relieved of his command and sent back to England. He would spend the rest of the war in administrative positions, never again leading troops in combat. His moment of glory at Campo Mayor would be remembered, if at all, as a lucky exception to a pattern of poor judgment. The same aggressive instincts that had won the battle in March would be cited as evidence of his unfitness for command by May. Military history is often unkind to commanders who are bold. They are celebrated when boldness succeeds and condemned when it fails, with little acknowledgement that the same qualities produce both outcomes. Wellington himself, when he learned of the captured eagles, was pleased but characteristically restrained in his response. He recognized the achievement for what it was, a significant tactical victory that would boost army morale and embarrass the French. But Wellington was a strategic thinker, and he understood that the war would not be won by cavalry charges, no matter how successful. It would be won by patient, methodical operations, by sieges of key fortresses, by carefully managed battles fought on advantageous ground. Campo Mayor was a bright moment, but it did not change Wellington's fundamental approach to the campaign. In his correspondence, Wellington mentioned the captured eagles in passing, noting them as evidence of British cavalry's fighting spirit, but also warning against the kind of reckless charges that often led to disaster. "The cavalry did exceedingly well at Campo Mayor," he wrote to one of his officers, "but we must remember that such actions succeed only when the enemy is surprised and disordered. Against a prepared enemy in good order, cavalry charges without adequate support are more likely to result in the destruction of our cavalry than the defeat of the French." It was a fair assessment, one proven by subsequent events. But it also meant that Campo Mayor would not be held up as a model to be emulated. Wellington's caution, his emphasis on methodical operations over dramatic cavalry charges, would define the British approach to the Peninsular War. And in that context, Campo Mayor became something of an anomaly, a spectacular success that did not fit the dominant narrative of how the war was being fought and won. The French reaction to the loss of the Eagles was far more intense than the British celebration of their capture. In the French army, the loss of an eagle was treated with a gravity that is difficult for modern readers to fully appreciate. These were not merely regimental flags that could be replaced. They were sacred objects, blessed by the emperor himself, symbols of everything the French military represented. To lose an eagle was to lose one's honor. The entire regiment was stained by the loss. Every officer and soldier associated with it carried a burden of shame. The 26th Dragoons and the 2nd Hussars, both proud regiments with distinguished service records, were devastated by what had happened at Campo Mayor. Officers of both regiments faced official inquiries into how the Eagles had been lost. Some were cashiered, their careers ended in disgrace. Others were transferred to less prestigious units, their prospects for advancement permanently damaged. The common soldiers, who had fought bravely and who bore no direct responsibility for the loss of the Eagles, nevertheless carried the stigma. When soldiers from other regiments learned that a man served in the 26th or the 2nd, there were knowing looks, whispered comments, a subtle but unmistakable disdain. Marshal Soult, commanding French forces in southern Spain, was furious when he learned of the disaster. He had sent La Tour-Maubourg with overwhelming force to relieve Campo Mayor and scatter the British. Instead, La Tour-Maubourg had returned defeated, having lost 2 eagles and accomplished nothing of strategic value. Soult's dispatch to Paris minimized the defeat as much as possible, attributing the loss to unexpected British aggression and unfortunate circumstances. But he could not hide the central fact. 2 eagles had been captured, the first French eagles lost in the Peninsular War. Napoleon, when he eventually learned of Campo Mayor, was characteristically scathing in his response. The emperor had little patience for failure, and the loss of eagles represented a failure that struck at the core of his military system. He had personally thus instituted the eagle standards to inspire his soldiers and to create a mystique around French military power. Every time an eagle was captured by the enemy, that mystique was diminished. Napoleon ordered investigations, demanded explanations, and made it clear that such losses were unacceptable. But there was little he could do from Paris to prevent such incidents in the chaotic, fluid combat environment of the peninsula. The loss of the eagles at Campo Mayor had ripple effects throughout the French army in Spain. Officers became more cautious about deploying their eagles in combat situations where they might be vulnerable to capture. Some regiments began leaving their eagles in the rear during engagements, bringing them forward only for major battles where proper security could be maintained. This caution, while understandable, somewhat defeated the purpose of the eagles, which were meant to inspire soldiers and to serve as rallying points in combat. An eagle kept safe in the rear could not perform those functions. French morale, already strained by years of guerrilla warfare and by Wellington's methodical pressure, took another blow. The myth of French invincibility, already tarnished by defeats at Talavera and Busaco, suffered further damage. If the British could capture eagles while outnumbered 3-1, what did that say about French military superiority? What did it say about the vaunted French cavalry, which had swept all before it in Central Europe, but which seemed unable to overcome British resistance in Spain? These were questions that French officers and soldiers asked themselves in the aftermath of Campo Mayor, and the answers were not comforting. The peninsula was different from other theaters of war. The terrain favored defensive operations. The local population was hostile. Supply lines were constantly threatened by guerrillas, and the British, while they might be defeated in individual battles, kept coming back, kept fighting, refused to acknowledge that they were beaten. It was exhausting, frustrating warfare, so different from the dramatic, decisive campaigns that had characterized Napoleon's earlier victories. Back in the British camp, as the days passed after the battle, the immediate excitement began to fade and the reality of the situation reasserted itself. The war was not over. The French still held most of Spain. The key fortresses, Badajoz, Ciudad Rodrigo, remained in French hands. Campo Mayor itself, despite the battle fought in its vicinity, would eventually fall to the British through siege rather than through battlefield victory. The strategic situation had not fundamentally changed. Beresford continued his operations, moving his forces toward Badajoz, the great fortress that dominated the southern invasion route into Portugal. The siege of Badajoz would prove to be one of the bloodiest operations of the entire Peninsular War, costing thousands of British and Portuguese lives over multiple attempts. Campo Mayor would come to seem like a minor prelude to the horrors that awaited at Badajoz. Wellington, directing operations from his headquarters, was already planning the next phase of the campaign. He was pleased about the Eagles, certainly, but his mind was focused on the larger strategic picture. How to take the border fortresses without suffering crippling casualties. How to maintain his army's supply lines. How to coordinate with the Spanish and Portuguese forces. How to keep pressure on the French without overextending his own forces. These were the concerns that occupied his attention, not the celebration of a cavalry action, however successful. The 13th Light Dragoons, having lost a significant portion of their horses at Campo Mayor, were temporarily pulled out of frontline service while they received remounts and recovered their combat effectiveness. The regiment would fight in many more engagements over the remaining years of the Peninsular War, would participate in Wellington's advance into France in 1813 to 1814, would add other battle honors to their colors. But Campo Mayor would remain the regiment's proudest moment, the day when they had charged against impossible odds and had captured a French eagle. Regimental historians would preserve the memory, would interview survivors, would ensure that the story was passed down to future generations of dragoons. But outside the regiment, the memory began to fade almost immediately. Other battles, other victories, other concerns occupied public attention. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The British public, weary of war news after nearly 2 decades of conflict with France, paid less and less attention to dispatches from the peninsula unless they reported major victories or disasters. Campo Mayor was neither. It was a significant tactical success that changed nothing strategically. The captured eagles themselves, after being displayed in Lisbon and then shipped to England, were presented to the Prince Regent in a ceremony at Carlton House in June 1811. The Prince, never one to miss an opportunity for pageantry, made much of the occasion. The eagles were displayed, speeches were made about British valor and French defeat, and the officers who had been involved in the action were formally thanked. It was a moment of national celebration, a reminder that Britain was still in the fight against Napoleon and was capable of winning victories. But even this moment of celebration was muted compared to what would come later. When British cavalry captured eagles at Waterloo 4 years later, the celebration would be far more intense, far more public, far more lasting. Those eagles would be captured in the battle that ended the war, in the presence of Wellington himself, in a context that would make them symbols of final victory. The Campo Mayor eagles, captured in a small action on the Portuguese border, could not compete with that narrative. The eagles were eventually placed in the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, in a room dedicated to captured enemy standards and other trophies of war. There they would remain for decades, gathering dust, seen by occasional visitors, but largely forgotten by the nation at large. Veterans of the Peninsular War who visited the hospital could point them out to younger soldiers, could tell the story of how they had been captured. But the story grew vaguer with each retelling, details lost or confused, until eventually even veterans were not entirely certain which battle had produced which eagle. By the 1850s, 40 years after Campo Mayor, most of the men who had fought in the battle were dead. Those who remained were old men, pensioners living on half pay or in veterans' hospitals, their memories of the battle competing with memories of dozens of other actions fought over 6 years of campaigning. When they told stories of the war, they tended to focus on the famous battles, Salamanca, Vittoria, the assault on Badajoz, or on Wellington himself, whose reputation had only grown with time. Campo Mayor, if mentioned at all, was a footnote, a minor action that had occurred early in the war. The forgetting was not malicious or deliberate. It was simply the natural process by which history selects what to remember and what to forget. Every war produces hundreds or thousands of individual actions, skirmishes, battles, engagements. Most of them are forgotten because they lack some quality that makes them memorable. A famous commander, a dramatic setting, a clear strategic significance, a connection to larger historical narratives. Campo Mayor lacked all of these. It was commanded by officers whose names meant nothing to the British public. It occurred in a remote corner of Portugal that few British people could locate on a map. It had no clear strategic significance, and it did not connect to the dominant narrative of the Peninsular War, which was Wellington's methodical, careful campaign culminating in the invasion of France. The regiments that fought at Campo Mayor kept the memory alive in their own histories and traditions. The 13th Light Dragoons particularly treasured their role in the battle, making it a central part of their regimental identity. When the regiment recruited new soldiers, they were told about Campo Mayor, about the day when their predecessors had charged against impossible odds and had captured a French eagle. The story became part of the regiment's mythology, passed down through generations, embellished perhaps, but never forgotten within the regimental family. But regimental memory is not the same as national memory. A story preserved within a single regiment, no matter how carefully maintained, will not reach the broader public consciousness unless there is some mechanism to transmit it beyond the regimental community. In the 19th century, that mechanism was usually either official military histories, which focused on major campaigns and famous generals, or popular literature, novels, poems, songs that brought military stories to a wider audience. Campo Mayor received neither. Official histories mentioned it in passing, giving it a paragraph or two before moving on to more significant events. Popular writers ignored it entirely, preferring to write about Waterloo or the charge of the Light Brigade or other actions that had dramatic appeal. There was one brief moment in the 1850s when Campo Mayor might have achieved broader recognition. A military historian named William Napier, who had himself fought in the Peninsular War, published a massive 6-volume history of the war that remains one of the most detailed accounts ever written. Napier had been present at many of the major battles, knew most of the key commanders personally, and had access to official documents and private correspondence. His history was comprehensive, covering not just the famous battles, but also the smaller actions, the sieges, the administrative details that made the campaign possible. Napier devoted several pages to Campo Mayor, describing the action in detail and praising the valor of the British cavalry. He recognized it as a significant achievement, noting that the capture of 2 eagles in a single action was unprecedented in the Peninsular War and rare in Napoleonic warfare generally. He interviewed survivors, consulted official reports, and reconstructed the battle with care and attention to detail. But even Napier's account could not rescue Campo Mayor from obscurity. His history, while respected by military professionals and serious students of the war, was too long, too detailed, too expensive for general readership. The British public in the 1850s wanted shorter, more dramatic accounts of military glory, not 6 volumes of detailed campaign history. Napier's work was consulted by other historians, cited in military studies, used as a reference by staff colleges. But it did not make Campo Mayor famous. It simply ensured that the battle was not entirely forgotten, that some record remained for future historians to discover. The 20th century brought world wars that dwarfed anything that had occurred during the Napoleonic era. The British Army that fought in 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1940 was vastly larger than the small professional force that had campaigned in the peninsula. Casualties in single battles exceeded the entire size of Wellington's army. The scale of mechanized warfare, of aerial bombardment, of global conflict made Napoleonic battles seem quaint and distant, like medieval tournaments viewed from the age of the machine gun. In this context, the Peninsular War receded even further from British military consciousness. Waterloo remained famous, of course. It was too significant, too connected to the defeat of Napoleon, too embedded in British national mythology to be forgotten. But the other battles of the Napoleonic Wars, including Campo Mayor, became the province of specialists and enthusiasts. Military historians still studied them, still wrote about them, still analyzed their tactics and their significance, but they no longer occupied any meaningful place in popular culture or in national memory. The 13th Light Dragoons, like all cavalry regiments, was eventually mechanized. Its horses replaced by tanks and armored cars, the regiment maintained its traditions, its battle honors, its connection to its past. But the world in which cavalry charges decided battles was gone forever, and with it went much of the context that made Campo Mayor comprehensible to later generations. How could modern soldiers, accustomed to air support and armored vehicles and precision weapons, understand what it meant to charge on horseback, saber in hand, against massed enemy cavalry? How could they appreciate the courage required to make such a charge when outnumbered 3-1? The actions of their predecessors at Campo Mayor remained in the regimental history, but they had become as remote and incomprehensible as the battles of ancient Rome. By the beginning of the 21st century, 200 years after the battle, Campo Mayor had achieved a sort of perfect obscurity. It was not famous enough to appear in general histories of the Napoleonic Wars. It was not dramatic enough to be depicted in films or novels. It was not strategically significant enough to be studied in military academies as an example of operational art. It existed in the historical record. The reports, the casualty lists, the medal rolls all survived, but it existed as a footnote, a curiosity, an action that specialists might mention in passing, but that meant nothing to the general public. The captured eagles themselves remained on display, though not prominently. They were in museums, properly labeled and catalogued, available for viewing by anyone who took the trouble to seek them out. But how many museum visitors, walking past display cases full of old military trophies, would pause to read the small placard explaining that these particular eagles had been captured at Campo Mayor in 1811? How many would know where Campo Mayor was, or why the capture of the eagles had mattered? How many would understand the significance of what they were looking at? This is how history forgets. Not through deliberate suppression or censorship, but through simple neglect, through the accumulation of newer events that push older ones aside, through the death of everyone who remembered and the failure to pass memories on to those who come after. Campo Mayor was not erased from history. The records remain. Any determined researcher can reconstruct what happened. But it was forgotten in the sense that matters most. It ceased to be part of the living memory of the nation, ceased to be a story that people told, ceased to have any relevance to contemporary life. And yet, the battle deserves to be remembered. Not because it was strategically decisive, it was not. Not because it changed the course of the war, it did not. But because it represents something important about military history, about human courage, about the gap between what seems possible and what actually is possible when men are pushed to their limits. 3,000 soldiers facing 9,000. Outnumbered 3-1. In open country that favored the enemy's cavalry, without fortifications to defend, or terrain advantages to exploit. By every rational calculation, they should have been defeated, should have retreated, should have avoided combat until they could be reinforced. Instead, they attacked. They charged directly at an enemy that outnumbered them overwhelmingly. They fought with such ferocity and determination that the French, despite their superior numbers, were thrown into confusion and ultimately defeated. And they captured two of the most prestigious trophies in all of Napoleonic warfare, achieving what Wellington's entire army had not yet accomplished. This is worth remembering. Not because it fits neatly into larger historical narratives about the Peninsular War, or about Wellington's genius, or about the defeat of Napoleon, but because it stands on its own as an example of what soldiers are capable of when led aggressively, when their blood is up, when circumstances align in unexpected ways. It is a reminder that battles are not decided purely by numbers and logistics and strategy, but also by intangible factors: morale, determination, the willingness to take risks, the ability to seize fleeting opportunities. The men who fought at Campo Mayor were not superhuman. They were ordinary soldiers, professionals, certainly, trained and disciplined, but not fundamentally different from soldiers in any other era. What they achieved was extraordinary, but it was achieved through ordinary military virtues: courage, discipline, aggression, the willingness to follow orders, even when those orders seem to lead to certain death. These are virtues that transcend any particular era or style of warfare. They are as relevant today as they were in 1811. And yet we have forgotten them. We have forgotten the names of most of the men who fought at Campo Mayor. We have forgotten the details of the action. We have relegated the battle to the footnotes of history, a minor engagement mentioned briefly in specialized works, but ignored by everyone else. The eagles they captured gather dust in museums, seen by few, understood by fewer. The battlefield itself, that piece of ground near Campo Mayor, where 3,000 men defeated 9,000, is unmarked, unremarkable, visited by no one who knows what happened there 2 centuries ago. This pattern of forgetting is not unique to Campo Mayor, of course. Military history is littered with forgotten battles, obscure engagements that once seemed important but that were subsequently overshadowed by larger events. But Campo Mayor's obscurity is particularly striking because of what was achieved there. The capture of 2 imperial eagles in a single action was genuinely rare, genuinely significant. In the entire Napoleonic Wars, spanning more than a decade and involving millions of soldiers fighting across Europe, only a handful of eagles were ever captured by enemy forces. Each capture was treated as a major event by both sides, a triumph for the captors, a catastrophe for those who lost them. And yet, Campo Mayor, where 2 eagles were captured in one afternoon by a force that was badly outnumbered, has been almost entirely forgotten. Why? What does this tell us about how history is constructed, about which events are remembered and which are forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the nature of historical narrative itself. History, as it is taught and remembered, is not simply a collection of facts and events. It is a story, or rather a series of interconnected stories, and like all stories, it requires certain elements to be compelling: protagonists and antagonists, rising action and climax, clear causes and effects, meaningful consequences. Events that fit neatly into these narrative structures are remembered. Events that do not fit are forgotten, no matter how dramatic or significant they might have been in isolation. Campo Mayor does not fit neatly into the dominant narrative of the Peninsular War. That narrative centers on Wellington, his strategic genius, his patient methods, his eventual triumph. The story begins with British disasters in 1808 to 1809, continues through Wellington's defensive victories at Talavera and Busaco, reaches a turning point with the lines of Torres Vedras that stopped Massena's invasion, and then builds toward the great offensive victories at Salamanca and Vitoria before culminating in the invasion of France. It is a coherent narrative arc, one that makes sense as a story of how a smaller British force gradually wore down and defeated a larger French army through superior generalship and national determination. Where does Campo Mayor fit in this narrative? It was not commanded by Wellington. It did not represent a turning point in the campaign. It did not lead directly to any strategic gains. It was an isolated action, dramatic in its own right, but disconnected from the larger story. Historians writing about the Peninsular War face a choice: include Campo Mayor and disrupt the narrative flow, or omit it and maintain a clean, coherent story. Most have chosen omission, or at best, a brief mention before moving on to events that matter more to the overall narrative. The same problem affects the soldiers who fought at Campo Mayor. Historical narratives about wars typically focus on commanding generals and a few select heroes whose stories can be used to illustrate larger themes. Wellington is the protagonist of the Peninsular War narrative. Marshal Soult or Marshal Massena serve as antagonists. A handful of other officers, Hill, Picton, Crawford, play supporting roles. There is no room in this narrative structure for Robert Long, whose career after Campo Mayor was marked by failure and who was eventually relieved of command. There is no room for Lieutenant Colonel Head or Captain Brotherton or any of the other officers who led the charges. And there is certainly no room for Private Thomas Gough or Sergeant Charles Weymouth, common soldiers whose names appear in regimental records but nowhere else. Yet these men achieved something extraordinary. They deserve to be remembered, if not in the grand historical narratives, then at least in our understanding of what soldiers are capable of accomplishing. The capture of the Eagles was not a matter of luck or accident. It was the result of aggressive leadership, disciplined execution, and individual acts of courage by men who saw an opportunity and seized it despite overwhelming odds. This is the kind of achievement that military forces want to celebrate, want to hold up as an example to future soldiers. And yet, it has been largely forgotten. There is also the question of why the British military itself did not do more to preserve and celebrate the memory of Campo Mayor. After all, the capture of French eagles was unprecedented in British military history at that point. The army had fought the French for nearly 2 decades without capturing a single eagle. Campo Mayor changed that, providing tangible proof that British soldiers could match their French counterparts not just in defensive battles, but in aggressive, offensive actions as well. The answer lies partly in Wellington's own attitudes and priorities. Wellington was not a man who encouraged reckless aggression or who celebrated cavalry charges for their own sake. He had seen too many British cavalry charges end in disaster, troops breaking through enemy lines only to become disordered and vulnerable to counterattack, pursuing too far and being cut off and destroyed. Wellington wanted disciplined, controlled operations, not dramatic but costly heroics. Campo Mayor, from his perspective, was a successful action but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of aggressive cavalry operations. He did not want it held up as a model to be emulated. This attitude filtered down through the army. Official histories emphasized Wellington's methodical approach, his defensive victories, his careful management of resources. Aggressive cavalry actions like Campo Mayor were mentioned but not celebrated, noted but not analyzed in detail. The message was clear. This was not how the war was being won, and these were not the methods that should be studied and copied. There was also a class dimension to the forgetting. The officers who commanded at Campo Mayor were not from the highest ranks of British society. Long, Head, Brotherton, these were professional soldiers, competent and brave, but they were not aristocrats with powerful connections, not men who moved in the same social circles as Wellington and the senior commanders. They could not leverage social connections to ensure their achievements were celebrated. And the enlisted men who had actually captured the Eagles, Gough, Weymouth, and the others, were even further removed from the circles of power and influence that determined which military achievements were commemorated and which were forgotten. Compare this to Waterloo, where the cavalry charges that captured Eagles were led by officers from prominent families, where the Duke of Wellington himself was present, where the battle was immediately recognized as one of decisive historical importance. The eagles captured at Waterloo were celebrated not just as military trophies, but as symbols of British triumph over Napoleon himself. The soldiers who captured them became famous, at least within military circles. Their regiments proudly displayed the battle honor. The event was commemorated in art, literature, and public ceremony. Campo Mayor received none of this treatment. The eagles were noted, certainly, but they were treated as interesting battlefield trophies rather than as symbols of national triumph. The soldiers who captured them received modest rewards and promotions, but not lasting fame. The regiments involved added Campo Mayor to their battle honors, but the action never achieved the broader recognition that might have elevated it to national consciousness. And so the battle faded from memory, preserved in regimental histories and specialist military accounts, but absent from the broader historical narrative. The eagles remained in museums, their significance unexplained to casual visitors. The battlefield itself returned to agricultural use, the grass growing over the ground where men had fought and died, no marker indicating what had happened there. By the bicentennial of the battle in 2011, Campo Mayor had achieved nearly complete obscurity. There were no major commemorations, no ceremonies, no public acknowledgement that 200 years earlier, British soldiers had achieved something remarkable on that ground. A few military historians published articles noting the anniversary. A few enthusiasts visited the site and tried to reconstruct the action. But for the vast majority of people, even those with an interest in military history, Campo Mayor remained unknown. This is, in one sense, unremarkable. Most battles are forgotten. Most soldiers who fight bravely and achieve significant results are forgotten. History cannot remember everything, and choices must be made about what to preserve and what to let slip away. But the forgetting of Campo Mayor seems particularly unjust because of what was accomplished there and because of how rare such accomplishments were. Consider the statistics. In the entire Napoleonic Wars, French forces lost fewer than a dozen eagles to enemy capture. Most of these losses occurred at Waterloo, in the final, desperate fighting that ended Napoleon's 100 days. Before Waterloo, eagle captures were extraordinarily rare. The Spanish captured one eagle during the Peninsular War. The Russians captured several during the retreat from Moscow. The Prussians captured one or two. Each capture was treated as a major event, celebrated by the captors and mourned by the French. Against this background, the capture of 2 eagles at Campo Mayor stands out as genuinely exceptional. It was the first time in the Peninsular War that British forces had captured any eagles. It remains the only time in the war that 2 eagles were captured in a single action by British forces outside of Waterloo. And it was accomplished by a force that was outnumbered 3-1, fighting in open country against veteran French cavalry without the advantages of terrain or fortifications. This should be remembered. This should be taught in military academies as an example of what aggressive leadership and determined soldiers can accomplish. This should be commemorated as one of the British Army's finest hours in the Napoleonic Wars. Instead, it has been forgotten, relegated to footnotes, known only to specialists and enthusiasts. The men who fought at Campo Mayor deserve better. Private Thomas Gough, who leapt from his horse in the middle of a cavalry melee to seize a fallen eagle, displayed a level of courage that any military force would want to celebrate. Sergeant Charles Weymouth, who captured his eagle despite being wounded in the process, exemplified the kind of determination and selflessness that militaries depend upon. Lieutenant Colonel Head, Captain Brotherton, and the other officers who led their men in charges against impossible odds demonstrated the kind of aggressive leadership that wins battles. All of these men, and the hundreds of other soldiers who fought at Campo Mayor, achieved something extraordinary, and history has forgotten them. Why does this matter? Why should we care about a forgotten battle from more than 2 centuries ago? What relevance does Campo Mayor have to the modern world? The relevance lies not in the specific tactical details of cavalry charges and captured eagles. Those belong to a style of warfare that ended more than a century ago, but in what the battle reveals about human nature under extreme pressure, about leadership, about the gap between rational calculation and actual outcomes, and about how we construct and maintain historical memory. Campo Mayor demonstrates something that military theorists and historians sometimes forget in their focus on strategy, logistics, and operational planning. That battles are ultimately decided by human beings making decisions under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. On paper, the Battle of Campo Mayor should never have been fought. Long should have withdrawn his outnumbered force. The cavalry should not have charged against superior numbers. The men who captured the eagles should have been killed or driven back before they could seize the standards. Every rational calculation suggested British defeat. But battles are not fought on paper. They are fought by men whose actions are influenced by factors that do not appear in mathematical calculations of force ratios and tactical advantages. Morale matters. Leadership matters. Aggression and determination matter. The willingness to take risks matters. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, these intangible factors can overcome significant material disadvantages. This is a lesson that remains relevant to modern military forces, even though the technology and tactics of warfare have changed beyond recognition. Modern militaries still face situations where they are outnumbered or outgunned, where the rational choice would be to withdraw or avoid combat, but where aggressive action might achieve results that cautious calculation would never predict. The specific circumstances at Campo Mayor cannot be replicated. There are no more cavalry charges, no more imperial eagles to capture, but the underlying principles still apply. The battle also offers insights into military leadership, both its virtues and its dangers. Long's decision to fight at Campo Mayor was, by any objective standard, reckless. He was outnumbered 3-1. He had no significant terrain advantages. He could have withdrawn with minimal loss and rejoined Beresford's main force. Instead, he chose to attack, and his aggressive subordinates, Head, Brotherton, and others, executed that decision with enthusiasm. The result was a spectacular victory. But as Long's subsequent career demonstrated, the same aggressive instincts that produced victory at Campo Mayor could lead to disaster in other circumstances. At Usagre, just 2 months later, Long's cavalry would charge into a carefully prepared French position and suffer heavy casualties for no gain. The difference between brilliant aggression and reckless stupidity often lies not in the decision itself, but in factors beyond the commander's control. The enemy's preparedness, the terrain, luck, timing. This is an uncomfortable truth for military organizations that want clear lessons and replicable principles. We want to be able to say, do this and you will succeed. Avoid that and you will not fail. But military history is full of commanders who made the same decision in similar circumstances and achieved opposite results. Long was aggressive at Campo Mayor and won a great victory. He was aggressive at Usagre and suffered a defeat. Was he a brilliant commander or a reckless fool? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is that he was both, or perhaps neither. He was simply a man making decisions under uncertainty, decisions that worked out well in one case and poorly in another. Modern militaries struggle with this ambiguity. They want to train officers to make good decisions, to follow sound principles, to avoid unnecessary risks. But they also recognize that war requires aggression, boldness, the willingness to seize opportunities even when the risks are high. How do you teach someone to know when to be aggressive and when to be cautious? Campo Mayor suggests that you cannot, at least not with any certainty. The best you can do is train officers to be capable of both approaches and hope that they apply the right one at the right time. The battle also raises questions about how military organizations recognize and reward achievement. The soldiers who captured the eagles at Campo Mayor received modest rewards, promotions, small monetary, payments, mentions in dispatches. But they did not receive lasting fame or recognition. Their names are not known to the general public. Their achievements are not commemorated in monuments or celebrated in popular culture. Within a generation of the battle, most people had forgotten that it had even occurred. Is this how it should be? Should military achievement be measured purely by strategic significance? Should we remember only those battles that changed the course of wars, and forget those that, however dramatic in themselves, did not alter the larger strategic picture? From a purely utilitarian perspective, perhaps this makes sense. History cannot remember everything, and choices must be made about what to preserve and what to forget. But there is another perspective, one that values individual courage and achievement regardless of strategic significance. From this perspective, what matters is not whether Campo Mayor changed the course of the Peninsular War. It did not. But whether the soldiers who fought there did something extraordinary. And by any measure, they did. They fought against impossible odds and won. They captured trophies that were supposed to be uncapturable. They achieved something that Wellington's entire army had not yet accomplished. These men deserve to be remembered, not because their actions changed history in some grand sense, but because they exemplified the qualities that all militaries depend upon: courage, discipline, determination, the willingness to risk everything in pursuit of victory. If we forget them, if we consign their achievements to the dustbin of history simply because they do not fit neatly into larger narratives, we lose something important. We lose the stories that remind us what soldiers are capable of, what human beings can accomplish when pushed to their limits. There is also a moral dimension to the forgetting of Campo Mayor. The battle was won at a cost. British and Portuguese soldiers died there. Others were wounded, some permanently maimed. Horses were killed or injured. Men suffered pain and terror and witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The French suffered even more grievously. Hundreds killed and wounded. The humiliation of losing their eagles, careers ruined, reputations destroyed. When we forget battles like Campo Mayor, we forget the human cost of war. The battle becomes a footnote, a curiosity, a minor action barely worth mentioning, but for the men who fought there, it was the most significant event of their lives. Some died there. Others carried physical and psychological scars from that day until their deaths decades later. To forget the battle is, in some sense, to render their suffering meaningless, to suggest that what they endured was not important enough to be remembered. This is not to say that we should remember every battle, every skirmish, every minor action of every war. That would be impossible and perhaps not even desirable. But there is a difference between a reasoned decision about what to emphasize in historical narratives and a passive forgetting that occurs simply because no one bothered to preserve the memory. Campo Mayor falls into the latter category. It was not consciously excluded from historical memory as unimportant. It was simply allowed to fade away, gradually forgotten as other events claimed public attention. The question, then, is whether anything can or should be done to rescue Campo Mayor from obscurity. Should historians make a greater effort to tell the story? Should military organizations commemorate the battle more prominently? Should the British Army or the Portuguese Army or the communities near the battlefield site do more to preserve the memory of what happened there? There are no easy answers to these questions. In an age where every historical event competes for attention with countless others, where public interest in military history has declined, where even major battles of the world wars are being forgotten as the last veterans die, it may be unrealistic to expect that Campo Mayor will ever achieve widespread recognition. The battle lacks the elements that make for compelling popular history. A famous commander, a clear strategic significance, a dramatic setting that can be easily visualized. But perhaps the obscurity of Campo Mayor is itself instructive. Perhaps the fact that such an extraordinary achievement has been so thoroughly forgotten tells us something important about the nature of history and memory. History, as it is popularly understood, is not an objective record of everything that happened. It is a curated collection of stories that we have collectively decided are worth remembering. The criteria for that curation are complex and often arbitrary: fame, strategic significance, narrative coherence, emotional resonance, cultural relevance. Campo Mayor fails most of these criteria. It was not famous. It was not strategically decisive. It does not fit neatly into larger narratives. It does not resonate emotionally with modern audiences who have no connection to cavalry warfare or to the Peninsular War. And so it has been forgotten, not because it was unimportant. It was tremendously important to the men who fought there and to the regiments that preserved its memory, but because it lacks the qualities that popular history demands. This suggests that our understanding of the past is inevitably partial and selective. We remember what fits our narratives and our needs. We forget what does not. And this means that for every story we know, there are dozens or hundreds of stories equally worthy of remembering that have been lost. Campo Mayor is just one example among many. Does this matter? Should we be troubled by the fact that extraordinary achievements are forgotten simply because they do not fit our preferred historical narratives? Or should we accept that this is simply how history works, that not everything can be remembered, that choices must be made about what to preserve? The answer depends on what we believe history is for. If history is primarily a tool for understanding large-scale patterns and processes, the rise and fall of empires, the causes of wars, the evolution of societies, then perhaps individual battles like Campo Mayor do not matter very much. They are data points in larger analyses, interesting perhaps, but not essential to understanding the big picture. But if history is also about preserving human stories, about remembering what individuals and groups accomplished under extraordinary circumstances, about maintaining connections to our past, then the forgetting of Campo Mayor represents a loss. It means that the courage and achievement of the men who fought there has been deemed unworthy of remembrance, that their extraordinary day has been reduced to a footnote or erased entirely. The question that military historians have pondered when they have bothered to consider Campo Mayor at all is straightforward. How did 3,000 British and Portuguese soldiers defeat 9,000 French veterans and capture 2 imperial eagles in the process? What factors combined to produce such an improbable outcome? The most obvious answer is leadership. Robert Long's decision to attack rather than withdraw was the critical choice that made everything else possible. A more cautious commander would have looked at the odds, calculated that discretion was the better part of valor, and fallen back on Beresford's main force. This would have been the sensible decision, the one that military doctrine and common sense both recommended. Long would have preserved his force intact, avoided casualties, and positioned himself to fight another day under more favorable circumstances. No one would have criticized him for this choice. Indeed, given what happened to his career after subsequent failures, one could argue that Long should have been more cautious at Campo Mayor, that his aggressive instincts were a character flaw that eventually led to his downfall. But on March 13, 1811, Long's aggression was exactly what the situation required. The French were advancing in multiple columns, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, not expecting serious resistance. They were psychologically prepared for an easy victory, for the British to withdraw or at most to offer token resistance before being overwhelmed. Long's decision to attack disrupted this expectation completely. The French were forced to respond to an unexpected threat, to reorganize formations on the fly, to process information that did not match their mental model of how the engagement should unfold. This psychological disruption was amplified by the violence and commitment of the initial British cavalry charges. When the 13th Light Dragoons crashed into the French advance guard at full gallop, when British sabres began cutting down French troopers, when the sheer momentum of the charge drove the French back, the psychological equation shifted dramatically. The French, who had expected to be attacking, found themselves defending. The British, who should have been outnumbered and intimidated, were instead advancing with aggressive confidence. This role reversal, achieved in the first minutes of combat, set the tone for everything that followed. The tactical execution by British subordinate officers also played a crucial role. Head, Brotherton, and the other cavalry commanders did not simply follow orders. They seized opportunities, made independent decisions, and pressed their attacks with a ferocity that overwhelmed French resistance at the points of contact. When Head saw the eagle of the 26th Dragoons through the dust and confusion, he did not wait for permission or for explicit orders. He simply attacked, trusting his instinct that the eagle could be taken. This kind of decentralized, initiative-based leadership is what modern militaries call mission command, and it is often cited as a key advantage of Western military forces. But it requires officers who are willing to take risks, who can make rapid decisions under extreme pressure, who will act on their own authority when opportunities present themselves. The British cavalry at Campo Mayor demonstrated these qualities in abundance. They were not robots following a predetermined plan. They were professional soldiers who understood the overall objective: defeat the French, relieve the pressure on the siege, and who pursued that objective through whatever means presented themselves. When Brotherton found himself behind French lines with only 40 men, he could have withdrawn to safety. Instead, he saw an eagle and attacked a force that outnumbered him more than 20 to 1. This was not following orders. This was seizing an opportunity that presented itself in the chaos of combat. The quality of the British troops themselves also mattered. These were not raw recruits or militia. They were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of multiple campaigns. They knew their business. They could maintain formation under fire, could execute complex maneuvers under pressure, could fight effectively in close combat. The horses were well trained, capable of being controlled even in the chaos of a cavalry melee. The men trusted their officers, and their comrades knew that the men beside them would not break and run, would not leave them unsupported in the midst of combat. This professional competence meant that when the officers ordered aggressive actions, the men could execute them. Charging against superior numbers is terrifying, but professional soldiers can do it if they trust their training and their leadership. The 13th Light Dragoons did not break and run when they saw how badly outnumbered they were. They did not refuse to charge a second time after the first charge had left them exhausted and depleted. They simply did what their officers ordered, trusting that there was a plan, that the aggression would pay off, that their professional competence would carry them through. The French, by contrast, were caught off balance and never fully recovered. This is not to say they were incompetent or cowardly. They were neither. The French troops at Campo Mayor were veterans, skilled soldiers who had fought across Europe. But they had been prepared psychologically for an easy victory, for overwhelming weaker opposition through sheer weight of numbers. When that did not happen, when they instead found themselves under aggressive attack by an enemy that should have been retreating, they had to rapidly adjust their expectations and their tactics. This adjustment was made more difficult by the loss of the eagles. Once the first eagle was captured, word spread quickly through the French ranks. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Men who had been fighting competently suddenly found their morale shaken. The loss of an eagle was not supposed to happen. Eagles were sacred, protected, untouchable. If the eagle could be taken, what did that say about French invincibility? What did it say about the superiority of French arms? The capture of the second eagle compounded this psychological blow, creating a sense of crisis that spread through the entire French force. French officers tried to rally their men, tried to organize counterattacks to recapture the eagles, but they were fighting against momentum and psychology as much as against British cavalry. The British had seized the initiative and were not giving it back. Every French attempt to reorganize was disrupted by another British attack. Every effort to stabilize the situation was undermined by the knowledge that the eagles had been lost, that the unthinkable had happened. The terrain also played a role, though not in the way it typically influenced Napoleonic battles. The open country around Campo Mayor favored cavalry operations, which should have benefited the French with their superior numbers of mounted troops. But open terrain also meant there were no natural obstacles to slow the British charges, no broken ground that would disrupt their formations. When British cavalry hit French formations at full gallop, the impact was devastating precisely because there was nothing to slow them down, nothing to dissipate their momentum. The French had expected to use their numerical superiority to envelop the British, to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, to overwhelm through coordinated pressure. But coordination requires time and communication, and the British never gave them that time. The battle moved too quickly, with British attacks coming from unexpected directions, creating local crises that demanded immediate attention. French commanders found themselves responding to emergencies rather than executing their own plans, always reacting rather than acting. There was also an element of luck, as there always is in warfare. The British charges could have been stopped by steady French volleys. The men who captured the Eagles could have been killed before they could seize the standards. Brotherton's isolated troop could have been surrounded and annihilated before they could fight their way back to British lines. Any of these outcomes was more likely, statistically, than what actually happened. But luck favors the bold, and the British at Campo Mayor were certainly bold. By attacking aggressively, by maintaining pressure, by refusing to give the French time to organize, they created multiple opportunities for luck to work in their favor. From a purely tactical perspective, Campo Mayor demonstrates several principles that remain relevant to military operations. First, that aggressive action can sometimes overcome numerical disadvantage by creating psychological and organizational disruption. Second, that seizing and maintaining the initiative is crucial in fluid combat situations. Third, that decentralized command, with subordinate leaders empowered to make independent decisions, can produce results that centralized control cannot. Fourth, that morale and psychology matter as much as, or more than, purely material factors like troop numbers and firepower. But the battle also demonstrates the dangers of drawing overly broad conclusions from single engagements. Long's aggressive tactics worked at Campo Mayor, but failed disastrously at Usagre 2 months later. British cavalry charges sometimes produced spectacular victories and sometimes resulted in catastrophic losses. The capture of Eagles at Campo Mayor was a tremendous achievement, but it did not make capturing Eagles easy or routine. It remained an extraordinarily rare occurrence throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Military historians looking for universal principles or replicable tactics will be disappointed by Campo Mayor. The battle's lessons are subtle and contextual rather than simple and universal. Yes, aggression can pay off, but only in the right circumstances. Yes, seizing the initiative matters, but maintaining it requires a combination of skill, determination, and luck. Yes, professional competence and good leadership are crucial, but they guarantee nothing. The French at Campo Mayor were also professional and well led, and they lost anyway. What Campo Mayor really demonstrates is something that military organizations are often reluctant to acknowledge: that war is fundamentally unpredictable, that outcomes cannot be reliably calculated in advance, that the same decisions and actions can produce wildly different results depending on factors that cannot always be identified or controlled. This is an uncomfortable truth for organizations that want to train their personnel to make reliably good decisions, to follow proven principles, to achieve predictable outcomes. The strategic significance of Campo Mayor was limited. The battle did not change the overall situation in the peninsula. The French still controlled most of Spain. Wellington was still conducting a careful defensive campaign. The capture of the Eagles boosted British morale and embarrassed the French, but it did not alter the fundamental balance of forces or the basic strategic calculus. In fact, one could argue that Campo Mayor's lack of strategic significance contributed to its being forgotten. Battles that change the course of wars are remembered. Battles that demonstrate important tactical or strategic principles are studied. But battles that are simply dramatic, isolated victories with limited broader impact, tend to fade from memory unless they have some other quality: a famous commander, a particularly resonant story, a connection to national mythology that keeps them alive in popular consciousness. Campo Mayor had none of these qualities. It was commanded by officers whose names are now forgotten. Its story, while dramatic to those who understand cavalry warfare, does not translate easily to modern audiences. It has no connection to broader British national narratives about the Napoleonic Wars, which center on Wellington and Waterloo. And so it has been forgotten, despite the extraordinary achievements of the men who fought there. The legacy of Campo Mayor is a study in paradox, a battle of genuine significance that achieved near complete obscurity, a tactical masterpiece that influenced almost nothing, a moment of extraordinary courage that has been almost entirely forgotten by everyone except a handful of specialists and the descendants of those who fought there. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, its impact on the Peninsular War was modest but real. French morale in the region suffered. The loss of 2 eagles in a single engagement was unprecedented in the peninsula and sent shockwaves through French units operating in the area. Officers became more cautious about deploying their eagles in situations where they might be vulnerable. Soldiers questioned the invincibility that French propaganda had insisted upon. Marshal Soult, commanding French forces in southern Spain, found his operations complicated by the psychological blow his forces had suffered. British morale, conversely, received a significant boost. The capture of the eagles proved to Wellington's soldiers that they could not only match the French in defensive battles, but could beat them in aggressive, offensive actions as well. The myth of French military superiority, already damaged by previous British victories, took another blow. For soldiers who would spend the next 3 years fighting their way through Spain and into France, the memory of Campo Mayor, if they knew about it, offered reassurance that British arms could triumph even when the odds seemed impossible. But these effects were temporary and localized. Within months, other battles, other victories had replaced Campo Mayor in the immediate consciousness of both armies. The war ground on, and Campo Mayor became just another engagement in a long list of actions, skirmishes, and battles that characterized the Peninsular Campaign. By the time Wellington invaded France in 1813, most of the soldiers in his army had not been present at Campo Mayor, did not know the details of what had happened there, and had no particular reason to care about an action fought years earlier by units they had never served with. The captured eagles themselves became museum pieces almost immediately. After their ceremonial presentation to the Prince Regent in June 1811, they were placed on display at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, where they joined other captured enemy standards and military trophies. They were impressive objects: the gilded eagles, the rich fabrics of the standards, the inscriptions commemorating the regiments they represented. But they were also static, lifeless objects that conveyed nothing of the circumstances under which they had been captured, nothing of the courage and violence and chaos of the battle. Museum visitors in the 19th century could see the eagles, could read the small plaques explaining that they had been captured at Campo Mayor. But without context, the significance was lost. An eagle was just a golden bird on a pole, interesting perhaps for its craftsmanship, but not particularly meaningful to someone who did not understand Napoleonic military culture, who did not know how rare eagle captures were, who did not know the story of how these particular eagles had been taken. The regiments that fought at Campo Mayor maintained the memory within their own institutional cultures. The 13th Light Dragoons in particular made Campo Mayor a central part of their regimental identity. New recruits were told the story, veterans reminisced about it, regimental historians preserved the details. When the regiment celebrated its anniversaries or held formal dinners, Campo Mayor was mentioned along with other battle honors. Officers of the regiment knew the names of Gough and Weymouth, knew the sequence of events that led to the capture of the eagles, knew the tactical details that specialists and enthusiasts study. But regimental memory, while valuable, is inherently limited. It preserves history within a small community but does not transmit it to the broader public. A soldier serving in the 13th Light Dragoons might know all about Campo Mayor, but his neighbors, his family members, who did not serve in the military, the general public, they knew nothing. And as the decades passed, as the regiment was reorganized and eventually amalgamated with other units in the restructuring of the British Army, even the regimental memory began to fade. The names and the stories were still there in the archives, but fewer and fewer people knew them or cared about them. The officers who commanded at Campo Mayor saw their careers unfold in different directions, their association with the battle becoming progressively less central to their identities and reputations. Long, as mentioned, was relieved of command within months and spent the rest of the war in administrative positions. His obituary, when he died years later, mentioned Campo Mayor briefly, but spent more time on his earlier service and his connections to prominent military families. The battle that should have defined his career became instead a footnote, an anomaly in a record otherwise marked by mediocrity and failure. Head and Brotherton and the other cavalry officers continued serving, fought in other battles, gradually rose through the ranks or retired with whatever rank they had achieved. Campo Mayor was part of their service record, something they could mention when discussing their careers, but it did not make them famous, did not elevate them to prominence, did not ensure that their names would be remembered by history. They were competent officers who had fought well on a particular day, and that was the extent of their historical legacy. The enlisted men who captured the Eagles received their modest rewards and promotions and then returned to the routine of military service. Gough and Weymouth, the two men most directly responsible for seizing the Eagles, became sergeants and then, in Weymouth's case, received a commission, but their moment of glory lasted only briefly. They were heroes within their regiment, certainly, but outside that small community, they were unknown. When they eventually left the army and returned to civilian life, they carried memories of what they had accomplished, but those memories meant little to people who had not been there, who did not understand what capturing an eagle meant, who had their own concerns and their own lives to worry about. This pattern, immediate recognition followed by gradual forgetting, repeated itself across all levels of those who participated in the battle. For a few weeks or months after Campo Mayor, the men who fought there were celebrated, their achievement recognized and praised. But celebration is exhausting and cannot be sustained indefinitely. Other events demanded attention, other battles were fought. The war continued, and Campo Mayor receded into the past, becoming memory rather than current event, history rather than news. By the time the Peninsular War ended in 1814, Campo Mayor was already being forgotten. Wellington's final campaigns in Spain, culminating in the Battle of Vittoria and the crossing of the Pyrenees into France, overshadowed everything that had come before. These were the campaigns that won the war, that drove the French out of Spain, that contributed to Napoleon's eventual downfall. Campo Mayor, fought 3 years earlier, seemed like ancient history by comparison. And then came Waterloo. June 18th, 1815. The final, apocalyptic battle that ended the Napoleonic Wars once and for all. Everything about Waterloo was dramatic, consequential, memorable. The Duke of Wellington commanding, Napoleon himself present on the battlefield, the arrival of the Prussians at the critical moment. The final French attack, the Imperial Guard advancing against British positions, being stopped by disciplined volleys and then breaking for the first time in their history. The total collapse of the French army and Napoleon's subsequent abdication. At Waterloo, British cavalry captured 2 French eagles, the eagle of the 45th Ligne, taken by Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Royal Scots Greys, and the eagle of the 105th Ligne, taken by Captain Alexander Kennedy Clark of the Royal Dragoon. These captures occurred during the famous cavalry charge depicted in Lady Butler's painting Scotland Forever. Hundreds of horsemen surging forward, sabers raised, overwhelming French infantry formations. Ewart's capture of the Eagle was particularly celebrated. He fought hand-to-hand with multiple French soldiers trying to protect their standard, killed several of them, and finally wrenched the Eagle away despite being wounded himself. His story became legendary, immortalized in popular accounts of the battle, used as an example of British courage and determination. The Waterloo Eagles completely overshadowed the Campo Mayor Eagles. How could they not? Waterloo was the decisive battle of the age. The Eagles captured there were taken in the presence of Wellington himself. In a battle that involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, in an engagement that ended Napoleon's career and shaped European history for the next century. The Campo Mayor Eagles, captured in an obscure action on the Portuguese border 4 years earlier, could not compete with that narrative. Ewart became famous. His statue stands in Edinburgh Castle. His story is taught to Scottish school children. His name is known to anyone with even a passing interest in Waterloo. Gough and Weymouth, who had captured their Eagles 4 years earlier under circumstances arguably more difficult than Ewart faced, remained unknown outside their regiment. This was not because Ewart was braver or more skilled than Gough and Weymouth. It was simply because he fought at Waterloo, and they fought at Campo Mayor. History is often more about timing and context than about individual achievement. The 19th century saw a proliferation of histories of the Napoleonic Wars, ranging from multi-volume scholarly works to popular accounts aimed at general readers. Almost all of them devoted extensive coverage to Waterloo. Some covered the Peninsular War in detail, focusing on Wellington's campaigns and the major battles: Talavera, Busaco, Salamanca, Vittoria. Campo Mayor was mentioned, if at all, in a paragraph or two, noted as the first capture of French Eagles by British forces in the peninsula, but not analyzed in detail or given any particular emphasis. William Napier's history, published in the 1830s, was the exception. Napier devoted several pages to Campo Mayor, interviewing survivors and reconstructing the battle with care. But even Napier, for all his thoroughness, could not elevate Campo Mayor to the status it might have deserved, his see. History was too long, too detailed, too expensive for popular consumption. It was consulted by military professionals and serious students of the war, but it did not shape popular understanding of the Peninsular Campaign. The visual arts, which did so much to preserve and popularize other Napoleonic battles, largely ignored Campo Mayor. No major artist painted the capture of the Eagles. No dramatic canvas depicted the 13th Light Dragoons charging against impossible odds. The battle offered dramatic visual possibilities: cavalry charges, desperate hand-to-hand fighting, the moment when the Eagles were seized, but no artist chose to depict them. Perhaps because the artists did not know about the battle, or perhaps because they recognized that a painting of Campo Mayor would not sell as well as yet another depiction of Waterloo or of Napoleon at some dramatic moment. Literature similarly passed Campo Mayor by. The 19th century produced numerous novels and poems about the Napoleonic Wars, but Campo Mayor appeared in none of them. Tennyson wrote "The Charge of the Light Brigade," immortalizing a disastrous cavalry charge from a different war. Countless poets and novelists depicted Waterloo, but Campo Mayor, despite offering equally dramatic material, was ignored. The battle lacked the cultural resonance, the famous names, the clear historical significance that writers sought when choosing subjects. By the early 20th century, Campo Mayor had achieved nearly complete obscurity. The generation that fought in the Napoleonic Wars was long dead. Their children and grandchildren were dying. The institutional memory within the regiments that fought at Campo Mayor was fading as those regiments were reorganized, amalgamated, or disbanded in the various restructurings of the British Army. The Eagles themselves remained on display in museums. but fewer and fewer visitors knew their story or understood their significance. The world wars of the 20th century completed the process of forgetting. The scale of those conflicts dwarfed anything from the Napoleonic era. Casualties in single battles exceeded the entire size of Wellington's army. The technology of warfare had changed so completely that Napoleonic battles seemed as remote as medieval tournaments. British soldiers fighting in the trenches of the Western Front or in the deserts of North Africa had no connection to cavalry charges or captured eagles. The Napoleonic Wars became ancient history, interesting perhaps to specialists, but irrelevant to modern military concerns. In this context, even Waterloo's cultural prominence began to decline. The battle remained famous. Certainly, it was too important, too embedded in British and European culture to be entirely forgotten. But it no longer occupied the central place it once had in British consciousness. And if Waterloo was declining in cultural significance, what hope was there for Campo Mayor? By the bicentennial of the battle in 2011, Campo Mayor existed primarily in 3 places: in specialized military histories written for academic audiences, in the archives of the regiments that fought there, and in the memories of a handful of enthusiasts and descendants of those who participated. There were no major commemorations marking the 200th anniversary of the battle, no ceremonies at the battlefield site, no television documentaries, no popular books, a few blog posts, a few articles in military history journals, a few enthusiasts who visited the site and tried to reconstruct what had happened there. That was the extent of the commemoration. The battlefield itself had long since returned to agricultural use. The fields where cavalry had charged and men had died were now planted with crops or used for grazing. There were no monuments, no markers indicating where the eagles had been captured or where particular units had fought. A knowledgeable visitor with good maps and a detailed account of the battle could perhaps identify key locations, but for the casual observer, there was nothing to indicate that anything significant had ever happened there. The town of Campo Mayor itself maintained little memory of the battle. It was a small Portuguese town near the Spanish border, unremarkable except for its fortress and its location. Local residents might know vaguely that a battle had been fought nearby during the Napoleonic Wars, but few could provide details. The battle was not a source of local pride or identity, the way major battles sometimes become for the communities where they occur. It was simply something that had happened long ago, of interest to historians perhaps, but not to people concerned with the present and the future. This complete forgetting of Campo Mayor, from national consciousness, from popular culture, from local memory, raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember history and why. The battle objectively mattered. It was the first capture of French eagles by British forces in the peninsula. It demonstrated that British cavalry could match French aggression and win against superior numbers. It boosted British morale at a critical time. The men who fought there displayed courage and skill that any military force would want to celebrate. And yet it has been forgotten, almost entirely. Not because anyone decided it should be forgotten, not because there was a deliberate effort to suppress or erase the memory, but simply because it did not fit the narratives we wanted to tell about the Napoleonic Wars, because other events overshadowed it, because the mechanisms that preserve historical memory, popular culture, education, commemoration, never latched onto Campo Mayor the way they latched onto Waterloo or other famous battles. This forgetting represents a kind of historical injustice. The men who fought at Campo Mayor deserve to be remembered. What they achieved was extraordinary by any measure. Private Thomas Goff, leaping from his horse in the middle of Guide, a cavalry melee to seize a fallen eagle, displayed courage that should be celebrated. Sergeant Charles Weymouth, capturing his eagle despite being wounded, exemplified the determination that militaries depend upon. Lieutenant Colonel Head and Captain Brotherton and all the other officers who led their men in charges against impossible odds demonstrated leadership that should be studied and emulated. But they have been forgotten. Their names mean nothing to the general public. Their achievements are unknown except to specialists. The battle they fought has been relegated to footnotes and specialist publications. History has moved on, and Campo Mayor has been left behind. Is there anything that can or should be done about this? Should historians make a greater effort to tell the story of Campo Mayor? Should the British Army or the Portuguese military commemorate the battle more prominently? Should there be a monument at the battlefield site? Should the captured eagles be displayed more prominently with better explanation of how they were captured and what that meant? These are questions without easy answers. In a world where even major battles of recent wars are being forgotten as veterans die and public attention moves elsewhere, it may be unrealistic to expect that Campo Mayor will ever achieve widespread recognition. The battle lacks too many of the qualities that make for compelling popular history. It does not have famous commanders. It did not change the course of the war. It occurred in a remote location that most people cannot find on a map. It involved cavalry warfare that modern audiences struggle to understand or relate to. And yet the story deserves to be told. Not because it will change anyone's understanding of the Napoleonic Wars or provide crucial insights into military strategy, but because it is a story about human beings achieving something extraordinary under extreme circumstances. It is a story about courage and leadership and determination. It is a story about men who faced impossible odds and won anyway. These are timeless themes, relevant to any era, meaningful to anyone who cares about human achievement and the limits of human capability. The eagles themselves remain on display, though not prominently. They are in museums, properly catalogued and preserved, available for viewing by anyone who takes the trouble to seek them out. They are beautiful objects, crafted with skill, rich with symbolic meaning, but they are also silent witnesses to a forgotten battle. Symbols of an achievement that hardly anyone remembers. When visitors see these eagles in museum display cases, do they understand what they are looking at? Do they know the story of how these particular eagles were captured? Do they understand how rare such captures were? How significant this achievement was in its time? Or do they simply see old military trophies, interesting perhaps for their craftsmanship but not particularly meaningful? Just another example of the kind of thing that militaries display in museums? The answer, for most visitors, is probably the latter. The eagles are there, but their story is not. The physical objects have been preserved, but the context that gives them meaning has been lost. This is how forgetting works. Not through the destruction of evidence or the suppression of records, but through the slow erosion of context and meaning, until objects and names and dates remain, but the stories that make them significant have faded away. The sun is setting now on Campo Mayor, both literally and metaphorically. The physical sun sets each evening over the Portuguese borderlands, casting long shadows across fields where cavalry once charged and men once fought and died. And the metaphorical sun has long since set on the memory of the battle, leaving only shadows and fragments, a few names in regimental archives, a couple of golden eagles in museum display cases, a handful of paragraphs in specialized military histories. But before we let the battle fade entirely into darkness, before we consign it permanently to the footnotes of history, it is worth pausing to consider what was accomplished there on March 13th, 1811. 3,000 soldiers faced 9,000. They were outnumbered 3-1. They had no significant advantages of terrain or position. Every rational calculation suggested they should withdraw, avoid combat, wait for reinforcements. They chose instead to attack, and they won. Not just won, but won decisively. They captured 2 French imperial eagles, achieving what Wellington's entire army had not yet accomplished. They routed a force that outnumbered them overwhelmingly. They demonstrated that British soldiers, when led aggressively and fighting with determination, could match any force in Europe, regardless of the odds. This matters. It matters that men are capable of such things. It matters that courage and leadership and determination can overcome material disadvantages. It matters that the supposedly impossible can sometimes be achieved through sheer audacity and will. These lessons remain relevant regardless of changes in military technology or tactics. The specific details of cavalry charges and eagle standards belong to history, but the underlying principles, the importance of morale, the value of aggressive action, the power of leadership, the capabilities of well-trained professional soldiers, remain as relevant today as they were in 1811. The human cost of the battle must also be remembered. Men died at Campo Mayor. British, Portuguese, and French soldiers fell in that confused, violent cavalry melee. Some died instantly, cut down by saber or shot. Others died slowly from wounds, suffering through agonizing hours or days before succumbing. Still others survived with permanent injuries, lost eyes, deep scars, psychological trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The horses suffered too. Innocent animals caught up in human conflict, dying in terror and pun. War is not glorious. Battles are not romantic adventures. Campo Mayor was won at a cost in human suffering that we should not forget or minimize. Private Thomas Goff and Sergeant Charles Weymouth achieved something extraordinary in capturing those eagles, but they did so in circumstances of terror and violence, surrounded by death and suffering. To celebrate their achievement without acknowledging the cost would be to falsify history, to present warfare as something cleaner and simpler than it actually is. The French soldiers who died defending their eagles deserve to be remembered too. Guillemot and Domenjou, the eagle bearers who died trying to protect their standards, were brave men doing their duty as they understood it. They were not villains. They were soldiers serving their country, carrying standards that represented their regiment's honor. They failed in their duty. The eagles were captured, but they failed while fighting courageously against overwhelming odds. There is honor in that failure, even as we celebrate the British victory. This is the complexity that military history often struggles to convey. We want clear heroes and villains, unambiguous victories and defeats, simple lessons that can be applied to future situations. But real battles are messier than that. Brave men fought on both sides at Campo Mayor. Both sides suffered. Both sides achieved moments of courage and experienced moments of failure. The British won, certainly, and their victory was remarkable. But it was not a morally simple victory of good over evil. It was a tactical success in a war whose larger purposes and justifications were complex and contested. What lessons should we draw from Campo Mayor? What does this forgotten battle tell us that matters for the present and the future? First, that history is selective and often unjust in what it remembers and what it forgets. Campo Mayor should be remembered alongside more famous battles. The men who fought there achieved something extraordinary, but they have been forgotten, not because they failed or because their achievement was unimportant, but because their story did not fit the narratives that history chose to preserve. This should make us humble about our own understanding of the past. For every story we know, there are countless others equally worthy of remembering that have been lost. Second, that material factors, numbers, firepower, position, do not entirely determine outcomes. Leadership matters. Morale matters. The willingness to take risks matters. The British were outnumbered 3-1 at Campo Mayor, but they won because they attacked aggressively, because their officers made bold decisions, because their soldiers executed those decisions with skill and determination. This does not mean that material factors are unimportant. They obviously matter greatly. But it means they do not tell the whole story. Third, that the same qualities that produce success in one situation can lead to failure in another. Long's aggression won the battle at Campo Mayor, but led to disaster at Usagre. There are no simple formulas in warfare, no reliable rules that always work. Commanders must make decisions under uncertainty, and those decisions will sometimes succeed and sometimes fail, often for reasons that are not entirely clear even in retrospect. Fourth, that courage and determination are real and important human qualities that can achieve extraordinary results. We live in an age that is often cynical about traditional military virtues, that questions whether concepts like courage and honor have any real meaning. Campo Mayor demonstrates that they do. The men who fought there, British, Portuguese, and French alike, displayed genuine courage in circumstances that would terrify most people. They charged into danger, fought hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers, risked and often lost their lives. This was not meaningless. It was not merely following orders or succumbing to social pressure. It was real courage, real determination, real achievement. Fifth, that memory and commemoration matter. The forgetting of Campo Mayor represents a loss, not just to military history, but to our collective understanding of what human beings are capable of achieving. When we forget battles like Campo Mayor, when we allow the stories of ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things to fade away, we lose something valuable. We lose the examples that might inspire future generations. We lose the reminder that courage and determination and leadership can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. What would it take to rescue Campo Mayor from obscurity? A comprehensive popular history book that told the story in vivid detail, that brought the battle to life for modern readers. A documentary film that used modern cinematography and historical reenactment to recreate the cavalry charges and the capture of the Eagles. A monument at the battlefield site that commemorated the men who fought there and explained what they achieved. Perhaps all of these things would help, but perhaps, too, we should accept that Campo Mayor will remain obscure, that not every story can be rescued from the depths of historical forgetting, that some achievements will be known only to specialists and enthusiasts, no matter how worthy they are of broader recognition. What matters is that the story is told, even if only to a small audience. What matters is that someone remembers Private Thomas Gough leaping from his horse to seize a fallen eagle, Sergeant Charles Weymouth capturing his eagle despite being wounded, Lieutenant Colonel Head leading his dragoons in a charge against impossible odds. What matters is that the achievement is recorded, the courage is acknowledged, the sacrifice is honored. This essay is an attempt to do that, to rescue Campo Mayor from obscurity, if only temporarily. If only for the readers who have made it this far, to tell the story of 3,000 soldiers who faced 9,001, to celebrate the capture of 2 French imperial eagles, an achievement that remains extraordinary more than 2 centuries later, to honor the memory of men who did something remarkable and have been forgotten. The eagles themselves remain in their museum cases, silent witnesses to a battle that history has largely forgotten. But they are not entirely alone. Someone remembers, someone knows their story, someone understands what they represent, not just the British victory at Campo Mayor, but the courage and sacrifice of all the men who fought there, British and Portuguese and French alike. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be enough. In a world where even the greatest achievements can be forgotten, where even the most famous battles fade from memory, where the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things are constantly at risk of being lost. The fact that some record remains, that some memory persists, that someone still tells the story, perhaps that is the most we can hope for. The sun has set on Campo Mayor, the forgotten battle where 3,000 British soldiers defeated 9,000 French and captured Napoleon's eagles. But the story remains, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to look beyond the famous battles and celebrated generals to find the remarkable achievements that history has overlooked. It is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth preserving for future generations who need to know what their predecessors were capable of achieving. And now you know it too. If you enjoyed learning about the forgotten Battle of Campo Mayor, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are dozens of other forgotten battles, overlooked heroes, and untold stories from history waiting to be explored. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of the battle interested you most. Was it the capture of the eagles? The audacity of attacking while outnumbered 3-1? The stories of individual soldiers like Gough and Weymouth? Your feedback helps determine which stories I tell next. Thank you for watching and for helping to ensure that these remarkable achievements are not entirely forgotten.